And good morning, Patrice. Okay, great. Well, as usual, let's give it a moment to let folks get woven into the meeting. And I see those numbers moving a little bit, so let's give that a moment. Okay, everybody, welcome. We will get going in just a moment. In fact, while you do this, I'll share my screen so you know where you are. As usual, it takes a moment to get everybody woven into the meeting, so I just like to wait a moment and let the number settle down, particularly as members of the public get joined up here. Okay, great. It looks like we're ready to go. Good morning, everybody. My name is David Plum, and you are here at a meeting of the Advisory Committee of the Maine Offshore Wind Roadmap. We're glad that you're joining us today. On the screen, you'll see members of the Advisory Committee, as well as staff and some invited guests. We also have several dozen folks observing us today, and we welcome all of you as well to observe our meeting today. We are on Zoom, and so all the usual Zoom things apply, and thanks for advisory committee members and others keeping yourselves on mute if you're not speaking, just to help the audio quality. And thanks for all of you who are joining us as observers today. Let me turn it over to Admiral Gregory Johnson, one of your two co-chairs, to kick us off. Admiral Johnson.
Thank you, David, and good morning, everyone. A few things I'd like to mention at the start of this meeting. First of all, we have a new member to our advisory committee. I'm not sure if he's on yet, but I want to make you aware of that, and that his name is Isaac St. John. And he's a state tribal preservation officer for the Maliset tribe in Holton, but he also will be representing all of the Wabanaki tribes here in Maine, and it's an important part of the input to our process. As you are well aware, the indigenous peoples of Maine have been the longest beneficiaries of our Maine heritage, maritime heritage, and we are delighted to have him join us and be able to speak and give voice to their concerns. He's a graduate student right now at the University of New Brunswick, and studying his interests are the decolonization of archaeology and archaeological collections. And so we're delighted to welcome Isaac. And if he is able to join us, he will today, or we'll see him at future meetings. I'd also like to compliment the working groups on the tremendous amount of work that they have done over the last, since our last meeting. It's a tremendous body of work. We'll be hearing today for the first time from the fisheries working group, but others, the three others have also done a tremendous amount of work, and hopefully all of you had the time to go through the pre-reads, and you will see what I'm talking about. You'll notice that there's a tremendous amount of data that needs to be collected to support certainly the fisheries and wildlife and environment working group, but all of the working groups. I would like to emphasize that, again, these are ongoing conversations. The recommendations are intended to signal the general content and focus of the work to date, but they are not in it by any way, shape, or means intended to represent the final outcomes and consensus that we'll arrive at by the time we get through this. I would just add that what we're doing today, part of the deliberative process, and in any of these committees, the purpose of the deliberative process, collaborative process, whatever you want to call it, is that through this, our collective efforts always equate to and result in much better than the aggregation of each one of our own individual inputs. It's not only the foundation of our democracy, but it's, I think, the foundation of any kind of a working group like this that has varied interested parties in it. Since the last meeting too, I think another incentive that talks to the importance of our work and why we're doing it and why we want to decarbonize the Maine economy is the GMRI came out with their 2021 climate change report on the Gulf of Maine. And again, that speaks to the inexorable rise of seawater temperature, particularly in the Gulf of Maine. I also, interestingly, was, as I do every day, go through the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and this particular article struck me, and it was about clean energy stocks and talking about how they have done well over the past year. And despite the current downtick in January, they're still very strong. And just to read you a quote from that article, it says, "Driving the surge is a sea change in investors' priorities and increased alarm about climate change amid devastating heat waves, storms, and fires. The shift in sentiment helped push," and this, of course, speaks to the stock that's gone up the most, and that's Tesla, with their market capitalization of $1 trillion plus now. But I bring that up because in reality, the primary user of carbon-based fuels is the transportation sector. And if we're going to knock that out, it has to all be electrified. And to be electrified, of course, we need an incredible addition to the amount of electrical power that we're producing. And that's why we're here. So all of these things are coming together, talking about the importance of the project that we've undertaken. So with that, I'll turn it back to David, and we get into the heart and soul of what today's meeting is about. Thank you all again for being here and for your selfless efforts to see this project.
Thank you so much, Admiral. Fantastic. Okay. We had really hoped that this meeting was going to be in person up at University of Maine, and we're disappointed it's not, and we all know why it's not. To just create a sense, a little bit of, dialogue and talking with each other before we get going, I had a couple quick polls I wanted to run with advisory committee members. We're not going to run them as Zoom polls because just the way a webinar works, but I'm posting in the chat just for advisory committee members and members of the public. We'll do a little bit of polling at the end with you, but I'm dropping in a link here, and I'll ask that all advisory committee members click on it. It's just a quick link to 2 questions that I want to ask you. We'll do them one at a time. And as you click on it, you'll see what the first question is. And this is, since we last met, how much have you focused on offshore wind issues? And there's a couple answers to that you can choose. So just do a quick click on that Menti link that I threw in the chat. If anybody's having a hard time with that, let me know. And Magnus, when you start to see some results, go ahead and share your screen.
Yep, screen shared.
Great. So let's do this one question. These are quick hits, folks. These are not, look at that. This is updating, you can see. Fascinating. Okay. So people are focusing on, that's fantastic. I thought actually be a little bit more skewed to the right. It's interesting to see it's not. Let's go ahead and just push to the next question. You can click on that link again, or at the same place in your browser, say advance to the next question. The next question is, if you had to guess, when do you think we'll be able to meet in person? All right.
I like the optimism from this group this on a Friday morning before a snowstorm. That's great.
That's right.
I just want you to know I voted for March, so I'm optimistic.
Is God only knows optimistic is what I want to know.
Yes.
God only knows.
That's right. Okay, this is good. A lot of you think we can do it in May, and we are aiming to do something in May and to take Terry up on his invitation to bring us down to Cundy's Harbor. So that's good. All right, so let's stop that share. There's one more thing I wanted to do, which is not a poll like that, but I want to do a connecting question, like I call them connecting questions. And I'm going to throw this in the chat real quick. And this is for advisory committee members. I'd be interested if you could just write a few words in the chat to answer the question I just put, which is, what are you most eager to learn more about as part of this roadmap process that we're in right now? So if I could get all of you on the advisory committee to just put in a few words, what are you most eager to lean into and learn a little bit more about as we walk on this roadmap path together? So let's just let that go for a second. And when you do it, actually, could you chat to everyone, pick everyone as who you're chatting to, and that way folks can see who are attending as well. Thanks, Matt Burns. Yep, indeed a little biased there, Matt. If everyone could just take on the chat and answer that question, what are you most eager to learn more about as part of our roadmap process? Thanks, Will. Yeah. I like you all, I'm just reading here. John Perry writes, and it's just to me, but John Perry writes, high probability lease areas. Thanks, John. Thanks, Isaac. Thanks, Patrice, everybody. Okay. I'm just enjoying reading. That's why I'm being quiet for a second. I recommend everybody does. Dan Burgess writes, feedback from broad perspectives and public and the data information to inform our decisions. And Jeremy writes, how to package up our clean electrons to serve our load and those to our south. I'm just reading the ones that didn't get sent to everybody. Okay, great. Thanks everybody for those thoughts to kick us off. So Dan Burgess, who's your other co-chair, has a few words of context that I think are important for us to keep in mind as we get going and get into the thick of our meeting. Let me just quickly, before I turn it over to Dan, say what we're going to be doing today with an agenda slide. If you give me 1 second, I'll pull my slides back up, just so folks have a sense of what's on our plate today. These are the things we want to do, and number 2 is the big one, right? However, we're going to start, and Ben Martins is joining us today. We're going to get a briefing about fishing activity in the Gulf of Maine. And Laura Singal will say a little bit more about this, but in the same way we've gotten good technical briefings on the energy market issues and a lot of other things, this is going to be the beginning of a technical briefing around fishing. And the trip to Cundy's Harbor we've talked about is going to be a more significant piece of this. Number 2, we're going to get updates from the working groups. And here, the Fisheries Working Group gives us recommendations for the first time. We're looking forward to that, and we'll get updates from the other working groups. We're going to have a quick conversation around technical support and what additional technical support might be helpful as we finish up our roadmap process. And then we're going to talk a moment about the plan for some targeted stakeholder outreach and engagement in March and April as part of our process. So that's what we're doing today. Dan Burgess, let me turn it over to you for some words of context to kick us off.
Yeah, thanks, David. And I'm looking forward to all of today's sessions. I'm just continuing to be impressed by how much work is going on in the subcommittee meetings and one-on-one conversations. So what I want to do, if you can go to the next slide, is really, well, we'll keep going.
Yeah.
Give some context, both of what's even since we've last met, about what's happening related to offshore wind in Maine, and then also there's been quite a bit of activity both in the U.S. but then also around the world on floating offshore wind or offshore wind generally. So just wanted to set that context before we jump into our work. So we're going to hear a lot more later today on fisheries and fisheries management. And this, as David mentioned, is going to be a first step in a longer discussion. And as we go through these recommendations from all the groups, it's kind of continuing to refine them and work through them. But as you may have seen from the offshore wind newsletters that have been sent out earlier this month, Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts sent a letter to BOEM regarding offshore wind research and outlined some priorities for funding for studies and analysis from BOEM. Really, I won't go through each of them. You've seen the letter, but I think an important step from all three states to BOEM to indicate where some of our initial priorities are and to really advocate for continued funding from BOEM. We obviously submitted the research array application last year. BOEM is continuing to review that and is working through that. And our office is working diligently with a few folks from the state to look at the offshore wind consortium that LD 1619 is refunded and required us to set up. So we're working through that now. Don't have a specific update, but expect to have something on that relatively soon. So that's just a few updates for Maine. And at a high level, I'll try to go quickly given the time, but want to flag that again, the U.S. industry continues to grow. We're seeing the same in Europe. Actually, if you go back to, that'd be great. Floating offshore wind is accelerating around the world, and that we're seeing port investments as well. So next slide. So as you would have seen from some of the Exodus analysis, or if you haven't, this is the timeline of that they put forward of likely project development. So we've got, again, the Biden administration has said 30 gigawatts by 2021, and they've announced 7 new, their process for the 7 new lease areas, including active announcements related to the New York Bight, which you may have seen in the last few days. I think, that is going to be the largest ever lease auction for offshore wind. They're beginning the Gulf of Mexico environmental assessment, looking at wind energy areas, and then they're accepting public comment in California. And what you can see is the kind of red circles that there's close to a dozen or more projects that are anticipated for concurrent installation in 2025, 2026. And so there's quite a bit of demand to the south of us, and then clearly opportunity for port supply chain and other opportunities. And important to keep in mind how much development activity is ongoing and the timing of that. Next slide. You may have also seen a week or two ago that Scotland did their ScotWind leases, where they put out opportunity for tender and for lease areas. It was larger than expected. They expected 10 gigawatts, and they've secured, it looks like, 25 gigawatts. They received many more bids than anticipated. Something like 75 companies bid. They made 17 awards and included, I think, more floating than projects than was anticipated. So we're seeing, big progress in Europe, and I think we might have speakers from Scotland or from a few of the companies slated for some of the working groups later, just to learn more about some of those projects. But saw some of the big players involved in that process. And then, we talked about New York a little bit. They've announced a master plan, which is going to include deep water. They've kind of gone through a roadmap process for those first lease areas. And now as they look further out and the opportunities to increase their targets, they will be focusing on deep water projects as well. So I think this is, from an industry perspective, is good news. It's going to continue to increase development, increase technology, reduce costs. But I think it shows just the magnitude of progress beginning to be made. Next slide. And just finally, we're also seeing on the East Coast, other states developing their ports as they make these announcements. New York, again, announced $500 million in state funds for their ports. This is a rendering of the proposed port in Salem, which Vineyard Wind and Crowley have announced that they're going to be working on in conjunction with potentially state funding that has been proposed down in Massachusetts. So that's rendering of a potential port development in Salem. So all to say that all around us, we're seeing quite a bit of activity, and wanted to flag that before we get into our work. And then the final slide, the next one, just want to flag that U.S. Department of Energy came out with a offshore wind energy strategies document, and we won't go through all of them. We may actually be able to have them here to talk about it, but talks about the importance of extending the investment tax credit and talking about new tax credits for supply chain, and a whole number of other topics that we won't get to in detail now, but worth flagging. That's a good report on offshore wind energy strategies. And then finally, NOAA and BOEM have signed an MOU and are working on using best practices for science and sharing data, and considering offshore wind development and potential impacts as they go forward. So tons of activity. I went by them all really quickly. I think any of these could probably take an hour-long briefing, but wanted to provide that context before we jumped into our work.
Excellent. Thanks, Dan, so much. Appreciate that. With that context in mind, let's dive into our agenda. And the first thing up, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Laura Singer, who's collaborating with CBI on this work in my organization, to help introduce the next piece, which is Ben Martin's doing of a briefing on fishing activity. So Laura, take it away, please.
Great. Thank you, David. Really appreciate it. And good morning, everybody. I wanted to just introduce Ben Martin, who is the executive director of the Maine Coast Fishermen's Association. He's been the executive director for the past 10 years. And as David said, we've had some good information on supply chain and workforce and energy markets. And we thought it would really be good to understand the context of existing users in the Gulf of Maine and what's happening out there in that broad ocean, which looks so big to many of us, but has decades of activity. So Ben is going to provide some of that, but we also acknowledge that that's really just the tip of the iceberg. There is much to be learned about the ecosystem itself and the science behind that, as well as the complexities of how fisheries are managed and the businesses that currently rely on the ocean. So we are looking forward very much to try to put together a field trip to Cundy's Harbor. We're all going to be descending upon you, Terry, at some point, hopefully in the spring, probably after the March meeting, but before we wrap things up in June, and look forward to really digging a lot deeper than what Ben will be able to present in the next 15 minutes. But we appreciate deeply, Ben, you coming to us today and giving a very brief high-level overview, and I'll let you take it away. I think you should have ability to share your slides. And then afterwards, we might have a few minutes here for a little Q&A. All right. And there's Kilo Pinkham. So there we go.
All right, there we go. Sorry. Thank you guys. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to me and talk a little bit about fisheries. Let me just swap this around so it makes sense. So thank you again. My name is Ben, and I'm the executive director of the Maine Coast Fishermen's Association. And we're going to be touching a little bit about a lot of things today, but I really do appreciate and hope this is the start of some bigger conversations, because this process is complex on our natural resources and the management of our people, places, things in the ocean. So thank you.
And Ben, we're seeing a sort of the double screen right now.
Oh, you're on. Okay. Okay. Well, is that okay, or do you want me to switch it up?
Can you, is it possible to switch it to the
Yeah, let me switch
single?
it. Does that work?
No.
No.
Oh, now it does.
It does?
on delay.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right. If that works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gulf of Maine.
Apparently, always a problem, huh? Laura, is that working?
Yep, I can see the beautiful Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank. And oh, now you're back.
Oh my goodness. I'm sorry. We should have done a test run, Laura, apparently. Good.
You're at 2, but why don't we just keep going? I think everyone can see your big slide.
All right. Sorry about that, everybody. We'll flow through it. It'll be a little bit wonky, but it'll be fine. So anytime I give a presentation on the Gulf of Maine, I always like to start with a reminder about the Gulf of Maine itself and our fisheries. And it's an incredibly unique area with cold water flowing through from deep water currents to the east. There's fresh water and nutrients coming in from all of our rivers and streams. And then the shallow area of Georges Bank causes this dynamic mixing of nutrients and sunlight. And it makes it one of the most productive ecosystems in the entire world. And it's a complex ecosystem, and we've really only scratched the surface of understanding that ecosystem. And that's before we introduce humans into that space. And as Laura alluded to earlier, this is a big, big area, but it's a busy area already. And so this is some data that we can pull from the Northeast Ocean Data Portal. This is the groundfish fishery. The different shades of color are the transits of boats and the frequency of transits. And so if you think about groundfish and then you add on monkfish, throw in some scallop fisheries, throw in the herring fishery, we've got a huge population of recreational boaters and recreational fishermen. We've got whale washing and other forms of ecotourism. And then on top of that, all the other boat traffic that takes place within the Gulf of Maine as we move people and food and stuff around the Northeast. And so it's a very crowded area. And I haven't even talked about fisheries like tuna or lobster. And that's because we have incredibly little data publicly available for those fisheries. And so on top of that effort, we then start to layer on this complex set of regulations that differ from fishery to fishery, permit to permit, state to state. There are closed areas, there are zones that you can fish in or not fish in, depending upon your permit, the time of year. There are closures to protect spawning and habitat and whales. And then on top of all these things, there's this other layer of creating management and rules from the states to manage people and places. And it means that all of these regulations for each fishery are like 100 pages thick, and they change frequently. They're dynamic. They're as dynamic as the seafood that these rules allow us to harvest. And despite stressing the complexities of all these things, as we talk about fisheries management, when you really get down to the nuts and bolts and distill it down, there's only one specific thing that our managers can really do, and they can control mortality. And so fisheries managers don't have a say in pollution or runoff or development or ocean use, but they, hold on one moment. Sorry, I've got 2 kids home today with COVID. So, so they contribute to the health of they can't control a lot of things that contribute to the health of our ocean ecosystems. And so fish stocks, when we're managing them, are either classified as overfished or not overfished. And then managers can use different tools to impact the amount of fish or scallops or lobsters that come out of the oceans. And that's depending upon if they want more or less to be caught. And the regulations really come into 2 bins. There's bin number 1, which is management through limiting fishing activity. And this is known as an input control. And an input control might limit the number of hours that you can fish in a day, or it might create a closed area or limit the type of gear that you can use. And so this is like the trap limits for lobstermen in Maine. And then bin number 2 of fisheries management is limiting through the actual pounds that are allowed to be caught. The seafood coming out of the ocean itself. And this is called an output control. And an output control would be a trip limit. So you're allowed 200 pounds of scallops a day. Or if you have an allocation of catch that you're allowed to harvest over a set period of time. That's how we manage the groundfish fishery in New England right now. Fishermen are given a number of pounds that they can fish in a year, and they have to figure out how to go do it. So despite these 2 bins of tools, there's often not exclusive. So you combine different management tools together in each management plan. And so that's where they get complex, is you start having input and output controls on top of each other to try and manage the people who are catching the fish and the seafood. So those are the tools, and obviously they get really complex, and we spend a lot of time creating and using and deploying those tools. But once you start thinking about where our fisheries are managed, that's also complicated. So there's 4 areas of our ocean that we manage. There's the intertidal and international waters that we're not going to touch on. And then there's the state waters, which is from the low tide to 3 miles. And that's managed by the state. And then the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. And then from 3 miles to 200 miles is federal waters, which is managed through a regional council system. And for the focus of we're talking about in federal waters, offshore energy production is going to be on many of those fisheries, so outside of the 3 miles. But even though this is a great graphic from the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, they draw a hard line in the sand there, that's not actually how it works in the real world. And so our state waters regulations for a species like lobster has a significant overlap on our federal waters and how we use those fisheries. So that's actually where I'm going to start, is with a quick overview of the lobster fishery, because it's so important to us, but it's also pretty complicated. And then we're going to kind of flow into the New England Fishery Management Council and some of the offshore fisheries that are out there in federal waters. So lobster management. So lobsters are managed by the state of Maine, and then the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, and also NOAA Fisheries. So we've got 3 different management bodies that are all managing this one resource together. And the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission is this interstate compact of groups that manage a shared resource. And then each state is on that commission. But then once they create this, they go through a very deliberative and public facing process. And then those rules and regulations come back to the states to enact them. But the states then, in a very similar way, when you talk about like California rules for energy, right? The federal government sets the standards, and then you can be more, you can add additional standards on top of that baseline. The Department of Marine Resources in the state of Maine can then layer other types of rules on top of what the Atlantic states suggests are the baseline. And so the state legislature might say, we're only not allowed to land lobsters from anything other than traps, or we have a limit on the number of permits that exist in Maine that can go out and catch lobsters, or the creation of our lobster zones. And then just as a reminder, that's only for state waters. If you want to go out into federal waters, you still have to adhere to all these rules, but then you need an additional permit from the federal government as well to go play outside of 3 miles. And I think that one of the biggest takeaways that I want to leave with you guys as we talk through this is that for the constraints that exist on our fisheries and fisheries management for fisheries management purposes is really creating a lot of the friction that we're seeing when we're talking about how we change the use of our oceans, right? So if you want to be a lobsterman in Maine, you must have a Maine state lobster permit. Those are limited in number and they're non-transferable. So if you don't have one, you have to come off a waiting list to get one. You're also constrained to the zone that you are allowed to be a part of. So you can't go fish outside of that zone. And then if you have a federal permit, you are still constrained to fish inside of that zone, even outside the state zone, state limits. So that means that if a development or a closure takes place within your specific zone, then you can't just pick up and move to a new area. You're constrained. Additionally, lobster fishing in Maine is owner operated. That means that the owner of the permit must be on the boat when it's at sea. And we have a lot of small boats and small businesses in Maine because of this, which is great. But it also means that when fishermen want to participate in a management action or a process like this, they have to take a day off the water and lose income from their business, which is another constraint. And then just as a take a big step back, we've got the Maine rules, but federal boats from other states are not constrained to those same zones, giving them a potential advantage out on the water, depending upon where you're home ported and where you're fishing from. So that's lobster, and that was really quick and dirty. But you guys arguably have the best resource in the world when it comes to understanding lobsters in Patrice McCarron, who sits on your advisory committee. So I would really encourage you to take advantage of her knowledge. Let's move into federal waters, and it's important to note that as we do that, the culture of Maine's small boats and small businesses is still really reflected in the makeup of our fleet in federal waters, which are mostly smaller boats and smaller businesses. And those boats usually have fairly diverse holdings of permits that include, and it usually includes lobster as a piece of that business in our small boats in Maine, even if you have a groundfish permit or a monkfish or scallop. So permitting. We'll touch on this quickly because it's a touchy point for our fisheries, in that most federal fisheries that we care about in Maine are limited access, meaning that there's only a certain number of permits that exist. But unlike many of the Maine permits that are limited access, these permits can be transferred. They can be sold and moved from person to person, business to business. So squid, herring, groundfish, lobster, monkfish for federal permits can all be bought and sold and have a wide range of values. A hook-only permit for groundfish might be worth $15,000. A big offshore scallop permit could go for $7 million. And so if a fisherman wants to change the area that they fish in, they want to change the species that they want to focus on, there's a significant investment in permits that you need to make, or gear and other types of things. We work with fishermen all the time to try and source permits. It's incredibly difficult to find the right permit that fits your boat and your business hopes. So to do a little bit of a deep dive into a couple of the fisheries that I really love, there's groundfish, and groundfish are species like cod, haddock, flounders, and they're collectively managed together. And the important thing as we kind of think about this is that when you have a permit with the groundfish on it, you're limited to the number of pounds that are on that permit based upon your history. And you're also limited to the baseline attached to that permit. And the baseline is the size, the length of the boat, and the horsepower of the engine. And so it means that fishermen are really constrained in where they can fish safely, and they can't move a permit to a larger vessel if there is a need to move further offshore. The other piece of that is if you, a lot of the permits that are smaller boats in Maine, they really fish in that 20 to 60 mile range. That's the sweet spot for a lot of our boats. And so if we need to go further out, there needs to be a significant investment in new permits and in new boats to make that a reality. And then the other fishery, just to highlight, is that scallops. Hey buddy, I know, I need you to be quiet for a little bit. The other fishery is scallops, and this is a really great emerging opportunity for the state of Maine. And the federal water scallop fishery, the biomass is growing for both state waters and federal waters, but it's federal waters, which is outside those 3 miles. It's that orange area on the map there. We've gone from a 70,000 pound fishery 5 years ago to a 700,000 pound fishery this upcoming year. But the permits that we have in Maine, the Northern Gulf of Maine permits, you can only fish inside that orange area. You cannot go outside that orange area if there's scallops outside or if there's scallops south of that line. And so that's a real constraint to that business. So we're going to quickly just throw, I hit on some of these constraints, and that's only on a couple of the fisheries. We've got herring and monkfish and other fisheries as well that all have different constraints. And but I want to talk about the management process for a minute because it's really important. And Congress passed this law, the Magnus and Stevens Act, which in 1976, which created this cooperative management structure and set a set of standards for how we create rules and regulations and the goals of our fisheries. And then they sent that management back to the regions, back to the communities. So we don't have a big fish bill like we have the farm bill in this management. Instead, we have cooperative management close to home where fishermen and not DC lobbyists are working with managers and scientists to build solutions to really complex problems. So we were in a meeting with BOEM a couple months ago, and the person who was presenting was great. And he really highlighted this. And it kind of was an aha moment, I think, for me and Meredith and others of like, BOEM is a pretty normal process for federal government, but it is not normal for how fishermen are used to seeing policy created. It's foreign, it's not friendly, it is uncaring, it is not collaborative. It may be normal for those who work in federal and state government, but it is not normal for how fisheries policy has been created for the past 50 years. And fishermen are used to a system that's around cooperative management and deliberative and science-based, and it's a long and slow process with a lot of opportunity for public engagement to be heard and participate. And so, you know, this is the New England Fishery Management Council that we work with in federal waters, how policy kind of bounces back and forth, but the intent was to get fishermen at the table. You guys got Terry Alexander on this board. Terry is a fisherman, and he served on the council for 9 years. He was an important person in every decision that the council made, and he got to vote on all of them. He got to put his hand in the air and create policy. and Vincent Balzano of Portland was on that council. We had fishermen from Glenn Libby and Jim Odlin and Dana Rice and a bunch of other fishermen throughout our history that have sat on that council and made decisions. But even if you're not on the council, every one of these little arrows that move back and forth between the council and committee and advisors, you can have an input at that point. And that's just, it's a really different process. Fishermen are at the table. And so when we start talking about BOEM and offshore wind development, fishermen aren't an active participant in the decision-making process with a designated seat at the table, and that's really hard. I'm getting close to the end of my time, so I'm going to fly through these last two slides, really high level. I'm excited to see the socioeconomic data that's going to be coming out as you guys do that work. But we've got 3,400 miles of coastline, and so it's not a surprise that Maine has this unique relationship with our oceans. We bring a lot of money across the docks. This is from 2020. I think that this past year, 2021, is going to be significantly higher with the high prices for scallops and lobsters. And that means that these fishing jobs are good jobs. They make a lot of money. They also spend a lot of money. So they're supporting their communities. They're buying ice and bait and fuel and coffee from the coffee shop and their boats, and they've got new gear and they've got all these things, the infrastructure. They churn through money. So a fisherman, there's a lot of money that'll come in a certain year, a lot of money goes out the door, and it all stays local. These guys don't leave the peninsulas that they live on. So that's the end. Thank you, guys. I ran through a lot of that, and thank you for dealing with some crazy kids in the background. I apologize. But we only scratched the surface. I'm really excited to go to Cundies with you all and kind of talk about some of the layers of management that the industry is navigating. And just as a final kind of parting note, fisheries management is still new. 1976. Before that, the ocean was the Wild West. There were no rules. There were no regulations. You were allowed to buy a boat and go fish, right? And that has changed. And we are still trying to figure out fisheries management and the oversight and the new rules and regulations. It's a complex puzzle that's a work in progress. And that's why for a lot of us, we see so much opportunity in our natural resources because we are still figuring this out. And when we talk about food production and food security, the oceans really are an opportunity that are still being built upon. And it's really great that we're having the start of this conversation as we think about how the oceans can be used collaboratively together into the future. So thank you.
Wow,
Thank you, Ben.
And I really appreciate you putting everything together, trying to do what is, as you said, I think someone's PhD thesis in as short a time as possible. And oh, by the way, toddlers and COVID. So a lot on your plate, and I appreciate you bringing a lot to this conversation and discussion. I know we're running really tight on time, but I think we're going to have maybe if there's one or two questions that people may have for Ben as a follow-up, and then again, we're going to, and I would invite people if they want to help as we design a session in Cundies Harbor to let me know. So any burning questions that people have for Ben? Suzanne.
Yeah, Ben, thank you for that. I think every parent on the line's heart went out to you in all of that. It's so tough, but thanks for getting this all across. I think this is like, again, a PhD dissertation, but if you or maybe even Patrice could chime in, I think one of the pieces that's so critically important for people to understand in this discussion is the amount of uncertainty in the future for the fishing industry, particularly with things like the right whale regulations coming into effect, and just the idea that, due to temperature changes and where this, species move, that it's not like you fish in this one place and you will fish in the same place, a year from now, 5 years from now, from 10 years from now. Can you talk just a little bit about the degree of change that you anticipate the fisheries in Maine seeing in the coming years?
Yeah, it's going to be a huge disruption, right? I mean, we don't know what the whale rules are going to look like, but there's going to be a massive shift in how we catch lobsters in the Gulf of Maine, presumably. And with climate change and movement of fish and fish stocks, that creates opportunity, like a lobster boom that's taken place in our Gulf of Maine. And then also we're seeing scallops come up in the Gulf of Maine. And so there is a ton of uncertainty as things move around. The one little quick aside is like we worked pretty closely with Stat Oil to try and help them find a spot in the Gulf of Maine when they were starting that conversation. And we had a bunch of fishermen that said, oh yeah, that spot on the map, that's good. And then 5 years later, that was the hot spot for tuna fishing for the last 3 years, right? And so it is really dynamic, and it's hard to use past performance to understand future opportunity in the Gulf of Maine.
Thanks.
Ben, I'd just like to double down on what Laura said. That was a wonderful presentation, and thank you for the tremendous effort you put into it. And we're all better for it. Thank you.
Great. All right, well, we'll have much more opportunity to dig deeper in the future. And David, I think I need to pass it back over to you. Our next thing on the agenda here is to really dig into the recommendations. And I think fisheries is going to be up first. Is that correct?
That is right. Thanks, Laura. Yes, absolutely. And thanks, Ben. That was great. Okay, so excuse me, with that context, we're going to get some updates now from the working groups. Today's a good day to talk about fisheries because we have recommendations from the fisheries working group to present today. You'll remember in December when we met, Meredith and Terry gave us an update, but now we'll be able to get some recommendations from that working group. We will also get some updates from the other 3 working groups which have met, and some of them have made some changes. Some of them are just deep in conversation. So we'll get updates from those 3 working groups. In the beginning, I sort of went flying over our sort of overall roadmap of how we're working together to get to the end of this year. And I'll just remind everyone and folks who are listening in as well, is we're in the initial stages of putting some draft recommendations on the table. And we're going to be spending the next few months to improve, refine, and generally make better all of these ideas that the working groups have started to put out there. So we'll be aiming for July of this year, having some more final recommendations coming out of the work groups. In between now and then are going to be a lot of conversations, some stakeholder conversations, and chances for input. And we will be looking at a draft roadmap in the fall in finalizing that roadmap towards the end of the year. So that's our process. Let me share my screen. I'm going to turn it over to Meredith Mendelson from DMR, and one of the 2 co-chairs of the working group, to walk us through the fisheries recommendations, initial draft recommendations.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I am going to walk through all of these this morning. We weren't sure Terry was going to be able to join us, so I'm going to go through everything and he'll interrupt me and chime in as he would like. I just wanted to start out, I was asked to kind of comment on how these recommendations fit with existing BOEM requirements. And if you've had a chance to read the full text of the draft recommendations that David sent around from our working group, you'll have seen that the fisheries working group is really specific about some of the actions under these recommendations. It's driven by a few things. First, the direct experience of working group members with inadequate communications and notification requirements. Second, the experience of scientists, policymakers, and fishermen with regard to offshore wind projects in southern New England and other parts of the region who have presented to the working group and shared their experiences. And third, extensive work done by scientists and stakeholders across the region to ensure that data from individual wind projects can be compared across projects and incorporated into existing data sets to inform impact assessment. So while these recommendations are generally in alignment with BOEM's existing regulatory requirements, they're also in many cases much more specific, and that level of specificity is both intentional and important. I'd also say that I think they're more adaptive with increased monitoring if adverse impacts are detected and accountability for communications if recommendations aren't met. I think the one place where the working group may exceed existing BOEM requirements is in the pre and post construction monitoring requirements, and that's also by design. I think it's fair to say that in the fisheries science community, there's a general sense that at least some of the existing BOEM requirements are applied inconsistently or are inadequate to assess existing conditions and analyze potential impacts, both at the project specific and the regional level. So given the scale of fishing activity in the Gulf of Maine, and specifically from Maine, is an order of magnitude greater than in other parts of the region, like southern New England, I think it's, the working group certainly is feeling that it's even more important that we get it right here. So with that, I'll start out. Our first recommendation is to work with BOEM and other federal agencies to strongly encourage or require developers to develop clear communication strategies and notification procedures. Some of the key issues here are having specific designated fishery liaisons and representatives who are there's a selection process that involves the fishing industry to identify those people, having clear communication strategies and metrics, making sure the notification requirements are met, including real clarity about survey vessel activity, and that there's an accountability process that has verifiable grievance and complaints involved, and then also an alternative dispute resolution mechanism. Next slide, please. The second recommendation is to work with BOEM and other federal agencies to encourage or require offshore wind developers to follow procedures that encourage full engagement with the fishing industry from throughout the region during survey operations. So this would include things like having understanding and engaging with local fishermen to understand the dynamics of that particular area where the survey activity is going to occur, having specific contacts available both at sea and on land at all times, perhaps having a fisherman on board the survey vessel who knows the area and can help kind of be an interface. And again, having accountability for deviation from that with gear loss compensation. And then finally, running automated information systems that help to identify where vessels are at all times so that fishermen can see where those survey vessels are working. Next slide, please. The third recommendation is to advocate for the G&G data, the geophysical and geotechnical data gathered by developers, to be made available in a way that is both accessible to and usable to fishermen, including making it available on their charting platforms so that they can benefit from some of that information and use it in their own assessment and comments in public comment opportunities. The fourth recommendation is to work with BOEM and other states in the region to pursue establishment of monitoring requirements for offshore wind leaseholders. And this is a really important requirement. So there's a lot here, so I'll just start going through it. The first piece is to do baseline biological, so this would be marine fisheries and marine mammals, as well as physical oceanographic monitoring and benthic monitoring. And to do that at a greater frequency, as I mentioned earlier. So for a longer timeline prior to construction, we recommended 3 years throughout construction, and then 5 years annually post-construction, and then at 2-year intervals until decommissioning. Again, that's a higher than what BOEM is currently requiring. Next slide, please. We're also recommending survey of the same kinds of resources along proposed cable corridors, independent review of monitoring plans by scientific experts, utilizing commercial fishing platforms as a mechanism so that there's knowledge and benefit from that expertise, utilizing protocols that are already used in fisheries assessment so that that data can be shared more broadly and that it's consistent across projects so that the data can be compared across the region. A really important component is identifying methodologies that can be used after offshore wind projects are constructed, because perhaps there are certain survey methodologies like trawl surveys where the vessels might not actually be able to operate within the array. And so it's really important to make sure that we are establishing survey methods that can be used after construction and that we're calibrating that work appropriately prior to construction. That might include gill net work, ventless trap work, thermal imaging, other types of approaches, acoustic surveys for pelagics. Next slide, please. I just kind of touched on this one. Furthermore, also trying again to make sure that our monitoring work is able to be compared across the region. So applying monitoring in a consistent fashion across different projects, rather than leaving it up to the individual developer to identify a monitoring strategy for their project that isn't going to be able to be compared across the region. Again, this issue of making sure that data is readily available in a way that people can access it and use it to inform their own understanding of a project's impacts and their ability to comment. Making sure that appropriate managers for fisheries understand the results of that impact assessment and pre-construction monitoring. And making sure that there is some accountability if we see that measures that are meant to be remedial in some way are being responded to, and that there's accountability again. Next slide, please. Recommendation number 5 is around the funding needed to sustain offshore wind research and monitoring.
Meredith,
Yes,
sorry.
Terry, please.
I just wanted to follow up a little bit on those scientific services, if you would. So one of the questions we get a lot with our advisory panel, and particularly from one guy, which and I think it's a good question, is what happens if we follow all these protocols and we find out that these wind farms are causing more damage to the environment and to fish stocks and to lobster stocks? What happens then? What do we do with that? What happens to that wind farm? Do we take that wind farm? Do we remove that lease and remove that wind farm, or do they just keep continuing on? So, you know, there's no answer here, but I think this group needs to ponder that question. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Thanks, Terry. Thanks for interrupting me. So the next recommendation again is around funding. We've had support from the legislature with a general fund appropriation to the Department of Marine Resources for $2 million. The recommendation is to continue that at the minimum, and that the state should also pursue additional funding, both independently and in partnership with other states in the region around the Gulf of Maine. And then also that we should be pursuing funding from federal agencies to ensure that the data that we have is available to inform designation of both wind energy areas and siting decisions within leases is sufficient to avoid or minimize impacts to commercial fishing. Terry, anything else you want to say before we move on to the next group of slides?
All set, Meredith. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Next slide, David. So this set of slides is around siting recommendations. So moving away from pre-construction to more specific and localized siting. The recommendation here is to engage with fishermen, scientists, and other stakeholders with expertise in fisheries, wildlife, and the environment to compile and map areas of known concentration of priority species, important habitat, and fishing activity so that we have that information available to appropriately site wind energy areas and leasing. And here the Fisheries Working Group is recommending that we consider not only current fishing activity, but also historic, that we're utilizing alternative methods to assess use where spatial information is poor or limited, such as in the lobster fishery and the tuna fishery and the recreational fishery, that we consider future resources and underutilized resources. So what is happening as a result of climate change? Where might there be new species that we might want to target as things change? And thinking about how things shift over time. Identifying high priority habitat, complex habitat, looking at protected areas, existing protected areas, and ensuring that those remain protected. And finally, avoiding areas that would have significant or unique impact on particular ports or regions. Next slide, please. We have two slides or two recommendations around port impacts. First, that the Coast Guard conduct a port access study to determine how fishing vessels transit through the area and how wind energy areas might impact that, and work with BOEM to address those transit needs as appropriate. Requesting also a port impact assessment by the state or federal government to determine if fishing vessels in a proposed wind energy area would be uniquely impacted in certain ports, or implications for those ports, local economies, and shoreside infrastructure. And we think here there may be a significant additional data needs to understand that. Next slide, please. This recommendation is one that we're still working on and is a complicated one. There is strong interest in the working group in advocating for the state to take a position on moving offshore wind construction further offshore and prohibiting construction of offshore wind turbines within a certain distance from shore to minimize offshore wind development and fisheries conflict. This approach is still being discussed by the working group and evaluated. There is not a proposed distance at this time. We've had multiple discussions around this, and I expect we will continue to for some time. But we wanted to bring it forward here to the advisory committee because we think this is an important issue and a way of potentially minimizing conflict. The next recommendation is to encourage and assist BOEM in providing active and direct engagement with the fishing industry through the development of wind energy areas in a more meaningful ways that really are mechanisms that the fishing industry can be heard and involved in. As you heard from Ben, that is sort of the standard of expectations in fisheries policy, and webinars and written comments on regulations.gov are not an effective strategy really for getting meaningful input from the industry. Next slide, please. Finally, we have a recommendation around sort of some equity issues. And the recommendation here is to assess existing state statutory and regulatory authorities related to permitting both turbines and transmission through an equity lens related to fisheries impacts, and to take any actions necessary to implement corrective actions if needed. So looking here at the efficacy of those existing authorities to address fisheries impacts anticipated from offshore wind, trying to understand the ability and cost of the fishing industry and their communities to participate effectively in the regulatory process, to think about the mechanisms that we could use to provide improved capacity and improve participation, and ways to improve that access, equity, and capacity through our state permitting process. Terry, I'm sorry, I forgot to stop again. Please jump in and add anything that you wanted to.
Well, recommendation 6, I thought historic fisheries, I've been in this business for 43 years now, believe it or not. I know I only look 29, but I've been in this business 43 years, and I've seen a lot of changes in these areas. For instance, the area that we just cited the research area in, I've caught a lot of codfish around that area over the years. I mean, not recently, but I mean, it's a really dynamic area. We just need to take into consideration the historic fishing in those areas. A shrimp, when we had a huge shrimp fishery, those wind lease areas were very important to a lot of boats along the coast of Maine, where coast of Maine lands 85% of the shrimp landed in New England. So 85%. So, I mean, it's a considerable thing to bear in mind as we're citing places. That's all. So that was all I had to add, Meredith.
Great. Thanks, Terry. I think that's it for us.
I think
Thanks
that's
for
it.
sharing with us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Meredith and Terry, for that. As you see, it's a very comprehensive set, and I encourage folks to sit with it if you haven't already. And Stephanie just put in the chat for everybody, if you're listening into the meeting today, the meeting materials are posted online, and there's like a 40-page packet that has the details of these sets of recommendations and the most recent versions from the other working groups. This is just an overview slide that shows the 11 recommendations that Meredith just walked through. Okay, let's move on to the next. The way we're going to work this, folks, is we're going to just walk through the presentations we have. If advisory committee members have questions, I encourage you to just throw them on the chat so we don't forget them. And after a break, we're going to have a discussion about all of what we're seeing. Okay, do you want to just say a word about this, Meredith, in terms of the additional sort of what's on your plate next as a working group?
Sure. Yeah, there's still quite a bit, I think, that we've heard from our various invited guests and things that have come up that we've put into a parking lot. And those include more specificity around transmission issues, again, kind of the transit concerns, the need for regional approaches, which I think is certainly something we see across all the working groups' recommendations. Questions about navigation and safety, particularly, around radar and rescues at sea. There's a discussion happening at the regional level around not just mitigation strategies, as we've already kind of started to begin working on, but also on compensation strategies if mitigation can't be achieved. Again, this question of accountability, which keeps coming up, is what is happening if we can't, if we don't see the behavior and the changes and the best practices that we're trying to encourage. And then cumulative impacts, which is really a struggle and something that is a critical question in environmental assessment in particular, and also, in fisheries activities, especially if we're only assessing sort of at the project scale. How do we get to a place where we're really understanding the cumulative impacts across a region or across the Gulf? Working group is also being asked at a number of points to provide feedback on the studies that are being conducted by other working groups. And I think there's also a substantial interest in contributing to the development of research priorities for the research consortium as that group gets stood up.
Super.
Terry, you want to add anything there?
No, all set.
Great. Okay, thanks again. All right, let's keep moving. We've got three other working groups, and one of them we break up into sections: the workforce, supply chain, and ports. We're going to start with the energy markets and strategies group. And here, one of the co-chairs, I believe, Selena Cunningham, you're going to be walking us through these slides.
Yeah, excuse me. Yes. And Jeremy, feel free to chime in too if you have anything to add as I briefly go through this deck. So go to the next slide. Thanks. So at the last advisory committee meeting, we went through the recommendations from the Energy Markets and Strategies Working Group. And those are the three recommendations here. Number one is establish a binding renewable and offshore wind target and a procurement strategy to achieve that target, looking at both energy needs from today out to 2050. And so a long-term view, but having a phased in incremental approach to offshore wind, meeting our offshore wind needs in the state. And that's the first one. The second is related, but having a number of policy and programmatic components to ensure cost effectiveness for offshore wind in Maine. As we heard from Dan earlier today, the industry is rapidly growing worldwide. We want to make sure that we are taking steps as a state and through partnerships to continue to see cost declines in offshore wind, which we're seeing. And then the third one, as Meredith mentioned as well, is the importance of regional collaboration when it comes to various components of offshore wind. And what we are doing now is having conversations within the working group and subgroups to really suss out what the details are of these. And so no changes have been made, but we're continuing to work through the specifics of these recommendations over the next weeks and months. Next slide. And so in addition to those topics, we are wanting to delve into more understanding and making sure that the siting permitting process from the state perspective is clear and consistent. And I think that there's obviously a lot of similarities across other working groups that are also looking at this area. So I think we'll be doing that work over the next months. And then lastly, there's a lot in the transmission development strategy area where we can serve to find a consistent way of pursuing transmission development that lower costs and also minimizes impact. So we have some work to do in that area as well. Next slide. And I wanted to just take a minute to, we've talked at various times, we heard from DNV, our consultant at the last meeting, but wanted to just make sure that everyone knew where we were in terms of the technical studies that are supporting the work that we are doing and the roadmap overall. And so the ones that are still in very much in the works and under development are at the top. So socioeconomic analysis. We have conducted some quantitative and qualitative work through DNV that they're putting together that analysis. Right now, they are focusing on interviewing people in the community to make sure that they have a good understanding of potential impacts and opportunities around offshore wind. That is probably going to take a couple of months to do. We want to make sure that we have time for those interviews. So we're going to complete that interview process before completing the socioeconomic analysis. We'll be sharing a draft with working groups to make sure that we can have an opportunity for feedback there too. And the deployment strategy, looking at various procurement strategies, is still in the works. And then the studies that are near completion are an overview of the offshore wind industry, looking out to 2050 and what the projections of the industry are. That should be ready in the next couple of weeks, and we will post that online. And then the energy needs assessment is nearly done as well. Lastly, on the transmission study, so DNV has conducted an initial transmission study looking at technology as well as best practices around transmission. That initial report will go from is part of the roadmap process, but it's also supporting a requirement from the Public Utilities Commission to report to the legislature. So the Public Utilities Commission will file an initial report that DNV is producing early February, and we'll continue the conversation and have a final report in the coming months that can incorporate additional thoughts, best practices, and comments from the roadmap process. And that can also be be a helpful tool as people consider further recommendations around transmission. So I think with that, unless Jeremy, you want to add anything, that is a quick overview of where the energy working group is at.
Excellent. Thanks, Selena. Appreciate that. Okay, we'll keep moving forward. We're going to go into the supply chain, workforce, ports, and marine transportation working group. We break that up into three pieces. The first piece will be supply chain, and Steve Van Bolt is here to help us walk through these. Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, David. Couple of quick comments first. For those of you who are relatively new to offshore wind, Maine's supply chain is not new. It's been around 10 to 12 years. Some of us have been working in it that long. I also want to take a minute just to thank the industry people that participate in the supply chain work. They all have day jobs and they've devoted an incredible amount of time to this effort. Lastly, before I get into the recommendations, if you don't want to listen to me, want to go get a cup of coffee, I can pretty much summarize them in 3 words that everybody can remember. First is consistency. We're looking for consistency in policy and in effort. We're looking for clarity in the same, and we're also looking for opportunity. We're looking for opportunity near and afar. We have 5 recommendations that have been in the cooker for a while. I'm going to run through them quickly and then talk about what's new since we last talked about them. First, we want to formally establish and initiate a clear state policy for offshore wind, along with sustained and sequenced effort to support it. Second, we want to establish a strong support and advocacy for Maine and to Maine on offshore wind opportunities. Third, we want to pursue national and international opportunities to prepare and promote Maine's supply chain and address current and future supply chain gaps. Fourth, we want to pursue regional opportunities and provide support to ready Maine's supply chain and address current and future supply chain gaps. And lastly, and this is new, we want to support Maine's businesses suited to build and retrofit smaller offshore vessels, as well as operate and service all types of offshore wind vessels and gear. Next slide, please. What's new? All right. With regard to recommendations 1 and 2, we have been updating wording to strengthen and add clarity to the ideas, which we hope we were successful in. Recommendation 3, a new supporting action. We want to emphasize how important it is to continue to support and develop Maine's offshore wind supply chain registry. In recommendation 4, we have some new supporting actions. We want to consider supporting a regional and national content requirement. We want to provide state incentives to foster manufacturing and the supply chain for offshore wind. And lastly, build capacity to adapt Maine's existing supply chain energy to the ocean. We have a robust industry currently servicing offshore wind. We want to get them out on the water. Next slide, please. Recommendation 5 is new. We woke up and realized we have Maine businesses that build and service offshore vessels, from tugs to potentially crew vessels. We want to make sure that we emphasize and promote that opportunity and exploit it to every extent possible. Next slide, please. What's next? First, further discussion of offshore wind goals and mandates. More work needs to be done there. We're looking for further exploration of regional collaboration at every level, governmental, in industry, and at the developer level. We're looking for further discussion and cross-referencing with the excellent work being done by Exodus and our other consultants in terms of investments, innovation, and wind energy area leasing. Importantly, we want to collaborate with the fishing working group to craft additional supply chain recommendations that involve the work of that group. We want to consider a supply chain recommendation around complementary activities with floating, using new fuels such as green hydrogen or ammonia. And lastly, we want a further consideration of the comments from the advisory group meeting on 12/14. We want to look at timing and when we're going to start actions, and we want to provide flexibility to explore various offshore wind opportunities. Thank you. Next slide.
I think you're done. Thanks, Steve.
Even to my 3 minutes.
Well done. Excellent. Steve mentioned the December 14th meeting. If you were not with us, like for instance, you're a member of the public here today, it didn't attend that December 14th. These working groups that are presenting now did a more detailed walkthrough of their recommendations then. And Stephanie Watson posted in the chat just a little bit ago to everybody the most recent packet of the full initial draft recommendations. We encourage everybody to take a look at those. Let me turn it over to Jonathan Poole to walk us through the workforce recommendations.
Hi, everybody, and good morning. Since our mid-December meeting, not a whole lot has changed, but we have had a lot of great conversations with stakeholders and members of the industry at large. We had three focus groups led by BW Research, who is the consulting firm supporting this work, that work to kind of clarify and gather more information on how we can continue to improve and refine our recommendations. And they're distilling that data and information now, and we'll include that likely in our next revision. Just a quick overview of our recommendations for the workforce side. The first is strengthen offshore wind career exploration opportunities for K-12 and CTE students. And Parker Hadlock of Chinborough had a great observation. He said, name another opportunity in a new industry that we've had 5 to 6 years to ramp up to. So we can look back to middle school age students and begin, encouraging them to get interested and participate in offshore wind career exploration opportunities. Next, we can increase offshore wind opportunities in Maine's post-secondary education institutions. Third, enhance and expand offshore wind training and apprenticeship opportunities. Recent article in Maine Biz highlighted the new funding going to the Maine Apprenticeship Program, which is great. And then encourage high quality jobs. That is, first and foremost, any part of this economic development activity is going to be to not just attract jobs, but attract high quality jobs that are supporting Maine people and Maine families. and then promote equity and workforce development. And then finally, like many other partners have talked about, coordinate and collaborate regionally to attract skilled workers to Maine. So the things that have changed, recommendation 1, added action to engage tribal education centers. We had some great participation during one of those focus groups with BW Research, and we just realized that we needed to include this as part of our recommendations. And then recommendations 4 and 6, we refined some language to be less prescriptive and more broad and open, realizing that there's still some research to be done, some work to be done to really understand impacts moving forward. And next slide. So next steps, like I mentioned before, we're going to incorporate the recommendations from BW Research. We'll include examples of workforce development in other states that have happened successfully, and then continue to refine recommendations around supporting high quality jobs and role of organized labor. This topic has come up a couple times, and we've had great conversations in our working group about this, and we'll continue to have great conversations as we refine this language and learn more about federal policy, considering BOEM lease structures, and then state policy as well. So this is just an ongoing conversation that we're having in the working group, and it's been very productive to date. So that's it.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jonathan. That's perfect. Let's just keep rolling. And Matt, you're up for ports.
All right, great. Thanks, David. Okay, so just a high level overview here. Not much has changed, but we do have a couple things to update the advisory committee on. So I'll just go through kind of where we're at right now. Overview of the recommendations that have come out of this working group so far. The first one, move forward with port development plans with urgency. I think everybody is cognizant of the fact that the best way for Maine to capitalize on the future of offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine and possibly outside of the state and the region is to develop port infrastructure. And so that's been a big part of the work here that we've been doing. Also kind of tying into that, discussing with neighboring states, the region's offshore wind goals and the role of floating technology in those goals, to try and quantify the need for infrastructure dedicated to constructing floating offshore wind foundations. Next would be to discuss with offshore wind developers the infrastructure needs of all East Coast offshore wind projects to help better inform our port planning moving forward. Consider studying impacts on other ocean users from ports that would support offshore wind. I think that kind of ties in with one of the fisheries recommendations that I read. I can't remember which number, but that's something where we're definitely aligned there. Continue the ongoing work of evaluating multiple sites in Maine that could support offshore wind infrastructure. So obviously we have our concept for a hub location in the Port of Searsport, and then, exploring what other port facilities and ports, how they could play a role in offshore wind moving forward is important work that we're doing right now. Pursuit of federal funding to develop offshore wind port infrastructure. I think not only the pursuit, but understanding the appropriate funding streams for, constructing a port facility of this size and scope. So really working with the federal delegation to help better understand that, and federal agencies as well to understand the various programs that exist out there. And then also kind of the newer recommendation, expose Maine's port-related supply chain to various stages of offshore wind projects. As Steve mentioned previously, there's an existing supply chain for wind in the state, and how can we pivot into offshore wind, with what's existing. Obviously, kind of keeping an eye on what's possible with fixed projects outside of the state, and then transitioning to floating as we get closer to, realizing our goals, or I guess stating what our goals are here in the state of Maine. Next slide. Okay, so one of the important things that we've done here with the first recommendation is in talking to Parker Hadlock with Chinbro, he's been a wealth of knowledge and has kind of challenged us in some ways about helping to refine those recommendations. So in having some conversations with him and my colleagues in the working group, really what came out of that was, okay, so you're talking about feasibility of a port. You have potential sites where port development to support offshore wind is feasible. Now make a business case for it. And he's right. That's definitely a wise thing to do, prior to exploring any potential port development. So what we've kind of done is to pivot back to our consultants to look at the work that's been done so far in the phase 2 study of Moffitt and Nichols' work, but also perhaps scoping some new work that we could have our consultants help us with to really develop that business case. And I do agree with him. I think that's a very important thing. So we've added that to our recommendations. We've also added a new recommendation, which is recommendation number 7. And I kind of touched on that in the previous slide, but exposing the port-related supply chain to various stages of offshore wind projects. Like I said, first with fixed and then with floating. So really that's an important part to look at the supply chain related to port and logistics services to kind of revolve around the wind market right now. So Maine can definitely play a role. I think that's definitely obvious to everybody here. So how do we do that and how do we pivot into that? I think it's going to be an important next step. Next slide. So obviously I talked about making a clearer business case for port development here. So taking a deeper dive with the consultants, that's something they're going to be helping us on, and then ongoing work that we're going to do in the working group. The study of multiple sites, I'll talk about that here a little bit later, but no real update on that work yet, just that it's forthcoming, and I'm actually in the process of reviewing a draft right now. So we'll have more to share as we kind of go back and forth with our consultants a little bit at the moment. And then stakeholder outreach, another important thing that I wanted to touch on. Obviously, we're doing a fair amount of that here in the working group, but specifically to the port in the Searsport area, we're planning a very robust stakeholder process that's kind of in the process of being built right now. We'll have more updates on that in coming meetings, but just know that we plan to prioritize that and make that a very important component of our work as we obviously explore potential port concepts further in Searsport.
Great.
And I think that's it.
Yep. Thanks, Matt. Really appreciate that update. We've got one more update, and I think John Perry is going to be doing that for us from the Environment and Wildlife Working Group. John, take it away, please.
Excuse me. Thanks, David. And so by way of quick review, the first of our initial draft recommendations is a mapping exercise with the objective to collect all the existing data, which is extremely limited in the Gulf of Maine. And we'll use that to help us to begin to identify areas in the Gulf where there could be the greatest conflict between offshore wind energy development and our wildlife resources. The second recommendation is for the state to initiate and lead an effort in conducting benthic habitat surveys in areas of the Gulf that have limited or poor bathymetry data, which can be used to create detailed sediment and habitat maps in the region. And obviously, to map the entire Gulf of Maine is not feasible. And so we envision, as part of this, the establishment of a collaborative initiative involving partners from academia, state and federal partners, NGOs, and other nonprofits in the region, as well as obviously the commercial fishermen, because we recognize their expertise. And with this initiative, identify and prioritize mapping areas in the Gulf of Maine. The third recommendation is to initiate a coordinated above and below water ecological baseline monitoring study in areas identified in the Gulf of Maine. And obviously a major component of this will be funding. And so we're recommending that the state continue to prioritize provision of the general fund for at least its current amount, which I believe is at $2 million, for monitoring and research in the Gulf in anticipation of offshore wind development, as well as to seek additional state resources and funding opportunities elsewhere. Recommendation 4 is to conduct tracking studies on our most at-risk species of animals in the Gulf of Maine, including species listed both under the federal and state endangered species acts, including or as well as both marine and non-marine birds, marine mammals, and the fish species identified as being especially susceptible and vulnerable to impacts from offshore wind energy development. And finally, recommendation 5 is for the state to investigate the potential benefits and processes by which it may use its federal consistency review authority under the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act to address issues of concern regarding offshore wind energy development in federal waters, including any potential changes to state laws and rules if necessary. All of this, is to help better inform environmentally sound siting of offshore wind development in the Gulf of Maine. Next slide. So since the draft was submitted, we've made some small but important clarifications to 2 of our initial recommendations. For recommendation 1, which was the mapping of the existing Gulf of Maine data, we clarified that migratory birds are not just traveling between our coastal islands, but that the far offshore environment itself is also a critical area for these and other species. And we want to make sure we capture that in our initial recommendation. We also corrected an oversight from our initial recommendations that the Gulf of Maine is also a significant area for migratory seabirds and waterfowl, something that we didn't capture initially, but we want to make sure we included. And finally, for recommendation 1, we were made aware of some additional but limited telemetry data, some banding data, some travel distance data by species such as terns and storm petrels that we can apply to this mapping exercise. And we want to make sure that this was included. And for our draft recommendation 4, we also made a seemingly small but critically important modification. We had failed to initially include that efforts to support the MODIS array would also be invaluable to research and the nocturnal use of offshore airspace in the Gulf by the millions of songbirds and shorebird migrants each year. This would be in addition to the endangered species and other wildlife we had listed in our initial recommendation. Next slide. And so, looking ahead, the group will begin conversations. In fact, we started these conversations, but we'll continue these conversations and explore several areas to help better inform impacts to wildlife resources in the Gulf. We met as a group back on January 10th, and we had a presentation from DNV, and the presentation provided an excellent overview of offshore wind transmission. And it also provided impact considerations and best practices into transmission capable routes. And overall generated a lot of really good initial conversation, which will be used as a basis for future conversations and future recommendations. We'll be exploring best management practices that can be utilized for the protection of our offshore wind wildlife resources. Ongoing and future meetings will be focused on utilization of best available knowledge and research to use for future baseline, pre and post-construction monitoring to assess what impacts are occurring or could occur to our wildlife resources and their habitats. We plan to begin exploring on what procurement requirements the state can implement on offshore wind developers, including are there any policy changes or regulatory avenues that the state can take to better ensure that impacts to Maine's offshore wildlife resources are minimized. We'll begin to investigate and ideally work with a soon-to-be formed research consortium. And finally, we'll be examining and soliciting feedback from studies being conducted by the other working groups. Importantly, the fisheries working group, and what are the implications and applicability they have for our working group. My other co-chair, Wing, is on board. If you wanted to add anything, Wing, otherwise I think we're good.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think you covered it really well. I just want to make one observation about the synergies and overlaps with some of the recommendations coming here from the Environment and Wildlife Working Group with the Fisheries Working Group. And 2 areas in particular I see is in the need for the mapping effort. And as we saw with the research array, I think there's great synergy between considering important areas for fisheries and important areas for wildlife as well, because obviously there's some strong drivers behind that, both of those that are strongly related. Also, when we consider the need for new data and monitoring going forward, again, I see strong synergies with the fisheries group. And while different methodologies may be needed in some types of surveys efforts, to some extent, the boats and getting out offshore is some of the greatest expense. And if there are our vessels offshore doing monitoring activities in relation to fisheries, I think there's some great opportunities to think about how biologists may be able to participate in those efforts and collect data that is supportive of the wildlife side and can be related to the fisheries side. So just a couple extra comments, and thanks, John. I think you covered it really well.
Great. Super. Thanks, Wings. Thanks, John. That's the end of our review of all the working group activity. And you can see that's a lot of activity, right? And we really want to emphasize the fact that we're thankful of the enormous amount of volunteer hours that have gone into this. Steve mentioned it, the industry have put in volunteer hours. A lot of people have put in volunteer hours to help make these thoughtful initial recommendations. Let's take a break now. And there's two things I want to mention as we take our break. One is just before we started our meeting, I sent you all an email with a 2-pager that is kind of a synthesis of all these recommendations. And that 2-pager may be helpful as we do the next section when we come back from a break. So if you have a way to just print that out and have that handy, I recommend you do it. And the other thing is, when we come back from a break, we're going to mix up the format a little bit and have something of a panel of 3 of you to have an initial conversation, and then we'll break it back open for everybody. So get ready for that. And the questions we're going to be asking of all of you and of our panel are the ones I just dropped in the chat. So if you want to meditate on those for a little bit as you take a break, feel free. Let's come back at 10 to the hour, so 10:50. And when we come back, we'll have a discussion about what we just heard and the questions that I just threw in the chat. So thanks, everybody. Take a break, turn off your cameras, and we'll see you back here at 10:50. Okay, great. Welcome back, folks. So what we'd like to do for the next 40 minutes is have a conversation about where we are in this process and what we're hearing from in these draft recommendations. We're going to have a 2-step process in this discussion. As I mentioned, we're going to have just 3 of you act as kind of like a panel initially and have a dialogue about this, and then we'll open it up to everybody. And we'll use the same questions, the ones I threw in the chat. Laura very cleverly has managed to put into the chat just now for everyone, including those of you attending, a 2-pager, which is a nice synthesis of all the initial draft recommendations that we have so far. And let me just say 2 words of context before we get going here. The first word of context is reminding us where we are in this process, right? We're at a stage where we're still pretty early in the process of developing recommendations, though we have a lot of hard work already represented on the page. And we'll be going out in March and April this year to do some targeted stakeholder conversations with people who haven't already been involved in this process to help us build this. And B, the working groups have from now until the end of June to really put a finer point on a lot of these recommendations and figure out what's going to be most meaningful for Maine. And in July, we as an advisory committee will get back together and look at final recommendations coming out of the working groups. Okay, so that's our process and that's where we're at. And so the moment right now for us as we think about everything we just heard from the working groups is, you know, is there anything that needs some urgent attention before we put these up on the website, more specifically as draft recommendations, and go out and do some stakeholder work, right? And also, more generally, what guidance are we trying to give to the working groups as they do their work? All right. And then the final piece of context is just remind everybody about Dan's opening slides about the level of activity that's happening all around us in this space, right? And we need to be very conscious about that activity because we are not alone in this story. And part of this effort is to be able to write a lot of our own story as opposed to having it imposed upon us by all the activity that's happening around us. Okay, so that's the context. Now, I have asked 3 of you to help with this panel. And the 3 of you that I've asked is Suzanne McDonald from the Island Institute, James Gilway, who's here as manager of Searsport, town manager. And I've also asked Matt Marks, who is here from the general contractors. And so the 3 of them are going to help us in the panel. And I'm going to help all of us clean up our screen. And the way we're going to do that is I'm going to need all of you to grab your mouse just for a second. Everybody from the advisory committee and everybody else, grab your mouse for a second. And if you hover over Stephanie Watson's name on the thing, because she doesn't have her video on, and there's 3 little dots on the top right-hand corner of Stephanie, or you could do it over John Perry's or Meredith Mendelson, anyone who doesn't have their video on. Click on the 3 little dots, and about in the middle of the menu is an option that says hide non-video participants, right? So you click on hide non-video participants from those 3 little dots in the corner. And then if you're not one of those 3 people I just mentioned, go ahead and turn your video off, right? So pretty soon we should just start to see on our screens, Suzanne, Matt Marks, and James, right? And we'll help folks who are having a hard time getting their video off, but we're almost there. We'll need Grant, if you can just pop your video off for 1 second, and Habib as well, and just turn off your video for 1 sec. And then we'll get everybody back on. Okay, great. We cleaned up our screen. It worked. Fabulous. Okay. Suzanne, Matt, and James, thanks for agreeing to be part of this moment of conversation. Let's just take, say, 15 minutes or the time we want and see how it goes. I'll post again the questions in the chat. And this is something where I'll facilitate, but don't wait on me to react to something that you're hearing or something you want to say. So feel free to just jump in. The first question of the 3 is about what's really emerging as priority actions for Maine. When you look at this and you know, I've got my little 2-pager printed out here, and you look at all of what we just heard today, and you think about this global and regional context for offshore wind, what's jumping out at you as, you know, ultra high priority steps that this roadmap needs to get right for Maine? I'll start maybe with James, if you just want to say a word from where you sit and what you're hearing. What are priorities that are clear for you right now? There we go. I got you.
Okay, I got to hold the button. It's new technology to me, so sorry about that.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think overall what we're hearing in this clearly is policy, policy, policy. And we need to define who and where that policy needs to be developed. And I think in doing that, we need to reach out to the legislative body, to other stakeholders, of course, which we're doing. But I think that policy development is important, and we have to get some buy-in from some of the folks that make the decisions. And I think that's going to be critical. And I'll stop there.
That's helpful, James. Matt or Suzanne, do you have a similar reaction of like, wow, there's a lot of policy that we need to start to get right, and that's going to be working with the legislature and others?
I'm happy, Suzanne, to weigh in here. I think I concur. And I think there are 3 things that stand out for me right away. Happy to expand when appropriate, but you know, we've got things that are going to take a little bit longer than others. And I think the three for me on the timeline are the ports, transmission delivery challenges, and then permitting. And the quicker we can, coalesce around getting those kicked off, I think the more success we'll see in getting things going and rolling.
Thanks, Matt. Suzanne, where's your head on this?
Oh, man. There's so much swirling around. I don't know that my thoughts really align with your questions so well, David. I've been trying to do that to prepare for you. But yeah, I mean, I see things a little differently. I mean, one thing that I appreciate and the theme that I'm hearing coming out from a lot of the working groups is the stuff that's going to take time, the ramp up. Parker Hadlock's comment, like we've got this great opportunity, but these are for things that are going to take years to fall into place. And so I think it's really important that there be this theme across the work of being able to prepare for where we need to be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years down the line. And so it makes me wonder, how do you set milestones along the way to make sure that we're really clear that we're on track and we're on that path? For me, so in a lot of respects, I feel like the work is really headed in the right direction. It's just a matter of getting some of the data and the studies in. For me, the way I approach this with my background in working with communities is really more on the social and sort of public acceptance and engagement side of things. And I really feel like maybe it, aligns with policy needs in terms of policymakers. But I feel like today I heard this really clear commitment across a lot of the working groups to make sure that the work was happening to engage with appropriate stakeholders at the right time. And I just am wondering how we might elevate that, both in terms of commitments through this process to doing that engagement and some sort of corresponding supports, whether it be education, how do the people we go to have any understanding of what we're talking about? How do they have context that's meaningful to them in understanding of these issues so that they can actually engage in the discussions? How do they have access to data? Meredith and Fisheries Group talked about, how do you level the playing field a little bit by giving access to helpful data to inform the discussion? So yeah, I guess that's one place that I feel like we need to prioritize. That's sort of a cross-cutting theme. And then, yeah, I mean, I'll stop for now. I feel like I will just say, for me, I'm thinking across where am I hearing tension, where sort of one thing relies on the other, or sort of, one piece is just this, how do we be cost effective and mitigate impact? I think there are trade-offs involved in a lot of this work that I don't know we've clearly put our fingers on. And I think that's the pieces that I feel like we need to elevate, because if we don't do that now, things are gonna come to a head down the road.
Nice. Okay. So I want to pull on a couple threads there. One is, Suzanne, you mentioned the word sort of engagement works best when accompanied by things like education and, good data. And are you seeing, Suzanne, in what we're looking at right now in these initial recommendations, enough of that? Like the sort of, how are we out educating, doing things? Are you seeing that accompaniment happening in these draft recommendations right now?
Definitely there's pieces of it. I think recognition of how to communicate with various groups is definitely there. I'm hearing our colleagues reference that. I do feel like we could go further. And I think maybe in December, I was just making stuff up, but I really appreciated being a part of the Climate Council process, how sort of a separate recommendation came together to really lean in and support on engaging Maine people on this. I feel like if we want people to deeply engage and understand this and sort of bring their best thinking and their perspective of impact and benefit and the creative, how we get to creative solutions, I feel like we need to create some support for that. And so whether it's helping municipal leaders follow along the conversation a little bit better, giving some trainings and support, if it's access to data, I think it might behoove us to think a little bit more deeply. I'm appreciative. I'm seeing a lot of aspects in the climate world where the state's being really responsive to saying we need a little bit more of support for municipalities on climate action. And so we're going to launch a program that supports that. And so I just think, what are the things that we can embed in this process or sort of hardwire in that allow us all to go into this process with the insights that are help us comment on what's going on and be a good thought partner. I just think, I think I've said, and a lot of us believe the outcome's only as good as the process that led to it. And what would be terrible is to get all these great recommendations and go down the road and see something as a result of sort of not being heard in the process or included in the process, or being able to really be empowered in that process, that things end up not moving forward on offshore wind because we didn't make that investment now. So I think it's there. I think I'd like to see us do more and understand how we're really going down this road in a way that's really it takes the Maine context into consideration. There's a lot of things that we're trying to do the same as other states to be competitive or do better. But I think I also just want us to be really clear when the context in Maine is different and requires us to be creative thinkers sort of outside the box. And I think that's one of those areas.
Thanks, Suzanne. James, Suzanne mentioned municipalities a couple of times in what she was just talking about. I wonder, when you think about what a town like Searsport needs, you had mentioned policy is something that's emerging here. Are there other things that you you want to see out of this roadmap from your perspective, from municipal perspective?
It's
good. You're good. Wait, you were better before. Hang on.
I was better before. Am I
there you
on?
go. You're perfect now.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. No fingers.
Yeah.
It's funny you mentioned that, because right now I'm working on a resolution for our Board of Selectmen in support of process. We've always been a town that's been engaged with different projects that have been proposed, and what we prided ourselves on over the years is the process that we went through for those. Some of them are here and operating in town. Some of them didn't make it. But a lot of at least one of our neighbors has already come out in opposition to this project, and it hasn't even hit a phase where it's applied for. So I think what we're trying to say is process is more important. Engaging the regional communities would be good, so that people could be educated. I've answered a few questions from the town manager out on Vinyl Haven about how close they would be, and what about flicker and the lights and all that. I did my best as a layman, being involved in this for as long as I have, to answer that, but it would be good if we had maybe a little more information available maybe through Maine Municipal Association, and Maine Municipal has a working group. Unfortunately, every time they've met, I've not been able to be there, but getting good information, good data out. I think this process is fantastic in trying to gather all of the hard data, and I don't know how to get them engaged in paying attention to what we're doing.
Yeah. Okay. I want to circle back to Matt, what you were saying around sort of these like core things that need to happen, whether we got to get our hands around the ports issue, we've got to get our hands around these other issues. Matt, when you look at this roadmap process and the things that are emerging from it, where do you think the state can really shine, right? And really do well through, a set of recommendations in this roadmap?
I think the reason I picked those three things is directly related to what Suzanne was just saying. In order to have good concrete community engagement, it's important for us to have some definition of what this is going to look like and what direct areas will be impacted. We've seen projects, small and large, go sideways that from our perspective may have looked really good and may have had even local community support. And maybe even sometimes not thought through, some of the support that fell through over time. So I think having concrete plans that show investment return, also, sort of looking at the future, I think from an investor standpoint or developer standpoint, encouraging them to come to Maine, having the ability to get portions of the project, really be viable, that they can see that there's a corridor to connect to the array that's been resolved by the state in advance, and rather than putting that liability on them, are probably critical things. And if we do it correctly, we can have the proper community involvement. That should happen before, or should happen, maybe concurrently with other things happening. But generally speaking, those are really long term. I mean, if you've ever seen the flow chart for a permit, whether it be Army Corps or otherwise, it's extensive. And, you know, from a perspective of an investor here, you know, they're going to want to know that there's a pretty decent chance that this project is going to move forward before stepping into our state. And we've had some project failures. I mean, let's be straightforward about it. So to Suzanne's point, I think getting the good technical engineering pieces done and showing what port investments look like, not just for offshore wind, but the other benefits that could come from that, probably long overdue, really will demonstrate, you know, that this project has viability and good potential for Mainers. So I'm with both of you on that, and I think to me that hardcore stuff is you know, that T&D and permitting process, and I think, you know, when you have a project of this size, magnitude, and impact, you know, we've learned a lot from land-based projects. You know, we can take those tools about community engagement happening earlier and really taking the time to think through, you know, how does this impact people's lives, and you've got a working waterway. You know, a lot of the onshore, the land-based stuff was on private land, and you know, it didn't directly impact somebody's ability to get their job done. This is different. So I think Suzanne's nailed it with that piece.
That's great. Was there anything that all three of you heard today that, you know, raised some serious alarm bells that you'd want to see some quick work done before we go out in March and more proactively try to do some targeted outreach? Is there anything that's like, wow, you guys better, like, could that working group please do a little update on that? Any alarm bells like that in terms of like the immediate next step, which is going out in March? Suzanne? I see some breath coming.
Well, this just may be my ignorance not being a part of the work group to know the specifics of the timeline, but I hear this, it's really helpful to have a goal, right? How much, and everybody's asking, how much are we going to do? I guess the thing I'm curious about is knowing where the socioeconomic study is at. If we're not really clear on impacts and benefits, and there's sort of more insights we can gain on that, I would hope that that could be an input into this question of how much. I guess it's a question really in terms of how the state wants to run this. Are we going to pick a goal and then figure out how we sort of balance impact and benefit and shape it within that goal? Or did the sort of insights that we gather from those reports inform how we set the goal? So I think I'm hearing a lot of people rightfully ask questions about that. And I think that's one thing we'd want to be clear on. How are we coming up with that goal? Because it connects to a lot of what we're actually seeking to see. So having that degree of clarity, I think, would be helpful. And I would just say, you know, like, is there space for other issues that are maybe related to some of what we've talked about here that should be coming up in the discussion? So, you know, I've heard from colleagues in the advisory committee, you know, Neil and Will and others have said, you know, we're talking all this focus on workforce. It's really hard to talk about workforce without talking about housing right now. And so I guess I'm just wondering, like, are there how far is this web going to go out to? Because there are some other intersectional issues to consider in here as well.
Interesting. Thanks, Suzanne.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
The idea came out about engaging with the federal partner, with BOEM, and I'm glad, you know, the Secretary of Interior is coming, Deputy Secretary of Interior. We need to have a better conversation with them about what are they going to do? I mean, are we really going to have a say if they put the lease out in 2025? All this work that we're doing, is it for naught? I think it's important that we get a really good handle, and I'm glad he's coming because that's going to help inform. And I think it's important that we also look at this idea of what happens if what came out of the fisheries group, what happens if this is damaging. The first study is important, but I think we need to also be looking at what's going on in the rest of the world as far as what is happening with the Scotland array. What impact is that happening? And I think we need to know how we can pull the plug if it doesn't look like it's going to work. I think that's an important question to have answered.
Thanks, James. Yeah. Matt, anything on your end on the sort of like the red flag space?
Yeah, I mean, I know there was some discussion around this in the working group, but you know, the land-based wind, work. We take a look at the peak, it was around 4,200 jobs and 250 million in wages, all very good things. But as we look forward in this project, and I know, I have union members and non-union members, the report certainly slants to one side. My concern is based on the number of GCs who are here who could viably do the work, at least located and based in Maine. You've got two companies who did about 100% of that work, who I'm sure are probably interested in looking at this. I'm a little concerned that this, the way it's modeled would really prohibit to some degree about 28,000 of those construction workers if we were go down that pathway to participate in that process. And right now it's hard for both union and non-union workers to train and educate and recruit workers. So I'm a little concerned about that red flag. I think it makes sense to engage those companies and their workers who did a lot of that work, very similar skills. And, we saw a lot of benefit from it. I mean, they're applying that across the country now. When the Maine land-based wind work started to decline, we're seeing them do work in Maryland and out west. These are all very good things for Mainers, and it's good for, Maine revenue. So I think that conversation should continue. I certainly understand, why both sides would want to invest in resources here. But I think in most cases on large projects, it's union and non-union workers working side by side. I think that's sort of been the main attitude all along.
Yeah. Great. Okay. So I had one more question, and I see Grant jumping in the chat. I had one more question before we drop to the full group, and that is when we are doing some targeted stakeholder work in March and April with folks who haven't been as involved in the working group process or this advisory committee, are there specific issues you think we really should be out there talking to Mainers about? Anything jump to mind beyond what you've already said? Because Suzanne, you really made the case earlier about how important all this is. But at this juncture right now, yeah, Matt, go ahead.
I think Suzanne did a good job of illustrating that. I mean, and to me, the work that can happen to show port benefit beyond just, the offshore wind capacity is a great asset. That supply chain coordination is important. And it starts there. It starts between transportation and ports. And there's going to be a lot of side benefits. I mean, you saw it with other road improvements that happen to allow access to land-based wind or solar. There's always a lot of that ancillary stuff that helps Mainers, more port jobs, more ability to bring cargo in, all those kind of really good side impacts. So I think Suzanne laid that out really well. I think on the transmission delivery side, having that discussion ongoing for not just this, but we're having the same challenges, obviously, with solar and other renewables. I think Mainers care about that. I mean, they want to see that happen. They want to see, that investment take place. So I think it's important to engage more Mainers in that discussion as well.
Great. Okay, James.
I was going to add, hey, just we have a resource, and I just want to make people aware that it's kind of in a little jeopardy. We have a magnet school here in Searsport for all things ocean, marine. And there's a bill in front of the legislature now to enact or not postpone a sunset clause on that. And I think it's important that we realize for the future what our resources are today, whether they be in the port or in education, and we make sure that we educate the people who are making those decisions. Again, I'm going back to Augusta on the importance of those assets, because I think this school, I'm biased because I helped start it, but I think it was really here for this type of thing, everything marine, whether it's operating boats or studying the science of it. And I think it's something that definitely needs some support, and that's imminent. It's within the next couple of weeks that decisions are going to be made whether this school goes away or not.
Thanks, James. I would love to just have all the advisory committee members turn your camera back on and let's jump into the conversation, all of us. I want to thank Matt and Suzanne and James for kicking us off with this conversation. But let's keep working on these same questions of what are really the priorities here that we need to be really paying attention to in the roadmap? Are there flags that we need to be pushing back to the working group and say, hey, careful folks, And then topics that we think are particularly relevant in this this piece of stakeholder engagement we're going to do in March and April. Terry, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, David. So question for James, I guess. When he said about answering that question that we get repetitively on our advisory panel about what happens if we find out these things are not good for the environment. What are the next step that we take? You know, I mean, we have some anecdotal evidence out of the Block Island area based on Rodman Sykes' presentation he gave to our advisory panel that it does affect different marine species. But that's anecdotal. We really have no data to prove that at this time, but I'm sure eventually that will come out. So it would be great for Meredith and I to be able to go back and answer that question to the group. What happens if these things are proven more of a hindrance than they are an advantage to the environment? So I don't know if anybody can respond to that.
Yeah, I think it's great that we're leading in this industry, but we're not the front runner. There are some others out there, and I think it's very important to stay on top of looking at what the impact is in those areas and extrapolate that to what might happen in the Gulf of Maine. I just think it's important to monitor what's going on nonstop.
Thanks, James and Terry. Will, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think just kind of jumping off at James's point, I think we are leading, and I think recognizing where we're also not leading. And you know, there are complex regulatory schemes meant to kind of keep up on this, and for us as a state to make sure we're doing this right and prudently. But I do want to caution. I think it's important to always understand, you know, and look at the cost benefit of any new technology and anything we're trying to do as a state. But if that's the place we're starting from, I think that's I just want to raise up the fact, you know, what James said about the magnet school, the opportunity, there are tremendous opportunities here. And I think that's a story that we need to be telling more and more and be really comfortable telling, while also recognizing that we need to stay on top of the impacts and make sure that we're ameliorating those impacts when they do arise.
Thanks, Will. Patrice, go ahead, please.
I think it'll be important when we go out to the public to give a more balanced context. I appreciate the update that Dan gave at the beginning of the meeting to sort of have good data and statistics about how the offshore wind industry is developing and what's happening where. But to Terry's point, there are active projects and there are significant challenges, and we never hear about that. I hear about that as a fishing industry person, and I am not an expert in offshore wind. So when I hear that at Block Island, only a couple of the turbines are spinning and the cable has become unburied, you know, what are we doing about that in Maine? I'm like, I really don't know exactly what's happening in Block Island other than what I read in the newspaper. So I know it's happening, but I can't address it or talk about how our process is going to hopefully put us in a better position than that. And similarly, you know, Europe went to offshore wind and apparently the wind wasn't as strong as it was supposed to be last year, and they didn't have storage and their energy prices spiked. So I think the premise that getting off carbon energy and switching to renewables is just really, really hard work. You know, anywhere where we have renewables to develop are probably remote places and somewhat pristine places. They're away from transmission, they're away from the grid. They're going to be expensive. We're going to be exporting energy. I think to just be more balanced and transparent about the fact that this is at its best new and best case scenario, extremely challenging would really help a lot, because everybody has their perspective. They're for it, they're against it, they're afraid of it. They think it's going to solve everything. You know, having good fact-based answers to everything that's going on and having a more balanced context, I think will really allow this roadmap process to be more effective in achieving its end, which is if this is going to happen in Maine, let's do it in a way that's going to minimize the impacts. And the other thing that I want to address is this sort of, I feel like we're always lost in this chain of misinformation. And Terry and I are both fishing industry people. But what I heard early on in the process is that when the ocean is leased, it's leased. And if the research array is built and we're seeing negative impacts on fisheries, the research array is built. It's a commercial contract and it's going to operate to its end. So I feel like that was answered clearly maybe by Selena in the beginning, because it is a lease for a commercial operation. And the fact that, like, I don't know, is that a question? I don't know. It seems like some of these very, very foundational issues are not being answered clearly and consistently. And as a person who's managing stakeholders who are very concerned, that just exponentially complicates the conversation. So I would really challenge us to not pretend that this isn't challenging, because it is. Let's just name it. I would love to have Geo be the person talking about what happened at Block Island or in Europe, and not me interpreting, Facebook or the media headlines, because it's just not a role that I should be playing. I'm here to advocate for my industry's concerns, not to try to, triage everything that comes through. So I really think we could do better. And I think the benefit of that is this process will be more on point for the state in the long run.
Thanks, Patrice. Thanks so much for that. Wing?
I have a slightly different comment, so I don't know if there's any others that want to reflect back on this thread of conversation, but I was going this way a little bit. Should I just jump in, or should we let others
It
jump
seems
in?
like Suzanne might want to jump in quickly on maybe building off Patrice, and then Wing. Thanks for opening that possibility. Suzanne?
Thanks, Wing. What a buddy. Yeah, I just kind of reflecting on what Patrice was saying and a little bit of what I was trying to get at earlier. I think what's really what I've seen resonate and create a lot of pride around this discussion for those who are willing to go there is when we talk about how the sort of Maine specific environment. And so, I mean, Habib's work to kind of talk about, Maine is deep water, this huge opportunity for us as a state. I think for me, I'm really curious how, as this goes out to the public, we can carry that thread through both the kind of pros and cons, and to say, this is, and I think I'm seeing the thread of that, right? I mean, Maine is trying to do the research lease is sort of an idea of like, we need to learn, we need to try this out, we need to do the research as we move along. I think the beginnings of that are there, but I think it's helpful when we can acknowledge Maine is different, right? We have some different challenges. To Patrice's point, it's not just talking about the fisheries piece. I think there's lots of different perspectives on this, but, it's something like 40% of all federal lobster licenses, are held in the state of Maine. I mean, the degree of coastline that we have to manage this conversation and these considerations for is so different than the other East Coast states. I mean, the town of Harpswell has like almost half the coastline of the entire state of Rhode Island. Like, there are things that are really different about trying to do this here that I think a lot of us are trying to be really thoughtful about. I really applaud Meredith and the fisheries group to say, what BOEM is doing is a start, but in Maine, because we have a different environment, like, we're going to think a little bit outside the box here. And so I guess I would just encourage us to think about, as we talk to the public, we can be more specific about what this means for Maine. It's not just an industry that all of the US is trying to get into. It's an opportunity for Maine in the Maine specific context. And how can we show that we're being responsive to the Maine specific context here? I think that might resonate with people a little bit more.
Thanks, Suzanne. Yeah. Wing, yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks. It's a really interesting discussion. I guess as I reflect on these questions, the priority, and you're sort of hearing this a lot, but I want to underscore it, is the critical importance of getting data in the form of mostly survey data to help inform decisions, and how much that can help the process. Yet, I think one of the sort of flags and issues around that we need to recognize is we will never be satisfied with the information that we have. Even if there was a $100 million, 10-year thing happened, it still would be insufficient. And I think something we need to consider, and this is, I think, a critical piece of stakeholder engagement, is we have the data we have at hand. There are going to be efforts to get new data. It's always going to be not what we want it to be. And we're always going to be wrestling with uncertainty, both as the Gulf of Maine is changing due to climate change, and just data gaps that we can never ultimately fill. So I think that's going to be a key place for stakeholder engagement, and experts weighing in on basically making decisions with what we have and recognizing it's going to be limited. And then another flag is watching out for this data-rich, information-poor situation that can stack up if there are a lot of independent data collection efforts that aren't sort of thought through. How are they going to connect with each other, potentially through integrated modeling efforts and other types of decision frameworks. And so I think going forward, and I think this is probably going to be a role of the research consortium, is really thinking about, as new data is collected, how is it being pulled in and integrated, and how is it going to be interpreted? So a couple of thoughts about that. And just realizing we're always going to be stuck with this question of how much data do we need, and do we have enough? And the answer is always going to be no, yet we're going to have to still make decisions. And that's a really tough tension. So that's sort of a general thought on some flags around this data discussion. I still think it's a strong priority to get that data. We need stakeholder engagement about the uncertainty piece, but we have to recognize where that data is not going to answer all the questions we want it to answer.
Thanks, Wayne. Very thoughtful. Grant, go ahead, please.
I just wanted to follow up on the comment earlier, and possibly Matt would like to go the same route as Parker and go out for beers or treat me. But I was just going to say, as far as union rates are concerned and union construction companies, Maine has one of the lowest scales for me and other trades. There are at least the East Coast, and the prevailing wage rates are lower than that. So when we're moving off into like this new industry, who exactly are we trying to attract to do this work? There's going to be thousands of construction jobs. If they aren't good paying construction jobs with good benefits and socioeconomic change for the Mainers, then what are we doing here? As far as offshore wind up and down the East Coast, we've seen time and time again that states are choosing to move towards, or developers are choosing to move towards project labor agreements and are working with organized labor because of the change in just transition that we can bring to the table. So I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Grant, for that perspective. Absolutely. Okay. Great. Selena, go ahead, please.
Sure. Thank you. And while it might not answer the question fully, I did want to just briefly respond to Patrice's question around the regulation of offshore wind projects. And we mostly talk about the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and leasing for offshore wind. Because there's not much in the water in the US, we don't really talk about the sister agency, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, which is in charge of enforcing compliance with all environmental, conservation, and safety laws. And so it may not answer the question fully, but that is a key part of the federal government's role in the future of when projects are constructed. So we can have BOEM talk a little bit more about that, but they do need to abide by existing federal laws. So wanted to just flag that. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Selena. Helpful. Will, last word on this.
Yeah, I think just perhaps a caution, and this is maybe former teacher Will Sedlak and not Will Sedlak of MCV, but I think one of the things that scares me and that I've seen already is this is such an information-rich environment, and fluency around all of those pieces of information is probably impossible. And I think we've seen this certainly, I think we've all learned things today from Ben. I think last time in December, we learned things about the energy markets and kind of how energy works. And I guess what I want us to maybe think through as we think through stakeholder engagement is, it is easy to bury learners with a lot of information. And if you aren't backwards planning from a goal, that is, why is the state undertaking offshore wind? Why are we doing this roadmap process? And building backwards so that the stakeholders feel like they have a structured environment to learn and to engage. I think it's doomed to be problematic. And I think that's probably the kind way of describing it. So I think making sure that when we do get information, that we are ensuring that the stakeholders that we're engaging with have the appropriate fluency to be comfortable with that information, and to make sure that we collectively, as the advisory council, are speaking in an accessible manner, and that we're doing this with a goal. And I think the goal is for me, in my understanding of the state's goal, is that the state is interested in pursuing offshore wind as a way to address climate change and to seize on an economic opportunity. And from there, we talk about the costs and benefits, and we look at Block Island, we look at what's being done elsewhere. But Maine is a small and wonderful place on this globe, but it's not alone. It's not an island, and I think we have a lot of lessons to learn from everywhere else, while of course putting it into a context. So really just an ask for us to make sure that we're not burying people in information, and that we're building up fluency for stakeholders.
Thanks, Will. Admiral, go ahead, please.
Thank you, David, and thank you everybody who have joined in this conversation. I would just like to say that we are on the margins, although to us it's everything, because that's our worldview, the coast of Maine and the Gulf of Maine. But it is a worldwide, hugely important strategic issue. And the reason we're here is, if you believe in global warming and climate change, and that the primary cause of that, or a very important cause of that, is carbon-based fuels. And so that's why we're here in the first place. It's already had a dramatic impact on our climate, on our fisheries and everything else. And as others have already said, we'll never have enough data. There'll never be a perfect solution. It's going to be a risk equation, gain, pain. And at the best, the gain bucket is not going to be totally full. There's always going to be some pain. There's always going to, which I equate to risk. And so we got to keep that in perspective. And just there never will be a perfect solution. And so let's not get caught up totally in data that can never be perfect, can never be everything. There's always more questions. I come from bureaucracies that are masters at that. And if they don't want to make a decision, you just keep doing studies and doing studies. And pretty soon you don't have to do any more studies, because the problem that you were going to study you've been overwhelmed and you've been overcome. And it doesn't exist anymore. For instance, cod fisheries. That's a good example, where we kept studying and studying and studying, and we didn't want to reduce quotas and what have you. And now that fishery is gone. And we know what's happened to the shrimp fishery. So anyway, let's just keep a perspective on why we started this process in the first place. It's a significant inflection point in how we're going to provide energy on a worldwide basis. And we're one part of it. But one of the things is we have more coastline almost than anybody. And that also makes us that much more vulnerable to what's going on out there in climate change, because of that huge exposure that we have, and the dependency of our state upon that, both in terms of our fisheries, tourism, and everything else. So anyway, I think we just need to try to keep that in perspective. And finally, I just appreciate the collegiality of this group and our willingness to roll up our sleeves and get working on it, so that we get to the end state we want, which are actionable recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral. So with that, let's do the last two things we wanted to do in this meeting. I will say, many of you here are co-chairs of working groups. Others of you participate in working groups, and we encourage you to do that. Let's carry these messages back to the working group space, right, where we're getting these recommendations going. Let's make sure that the next working group calls we bring back these messages. We'll do our part and make a meeting summary and keep some mental reminders of what we're talking about. And you all should help just with your own appreciation of what you're hearing, carry that back into the working group space. So we've got two more things we wanted to do today before we finish up. One is looking at the technical analysis, and the other is a quick peek at what we're trying to do in the stakeholder outreach. Laura, do you want to help us lead both? And I'll share my screen.
Terrific. Thank you, David. And thank you all for that great conversation. It was great to listen in. And Stephanie, I think we have you up. I know Selena gave a little bit of some background of the updates on where the technical studies were when she presented on the energy group. But Stephanie had a few slides to present in terms of what has been completed and where we are with some of the ongoing technical work, with an eye towards thinking about, are there any gaps? Is there any knowledge that we need to collect prior to completing our work that will help inform the work going forward? So Stephanie?
Great, thanks, Laura. I'm Stephanie Watson. For those of you I haven't met yet, I'm in the Governor's Energy Office. I'm the Offshore Wind Program Manager. This is just a slide of the technical inputs. So through the roadmap process, we're funding several technical studies with highly qualified and globally experienced consultants to provide us with the additional data and the information that we need for the working groups to develop our recommendations. And this includes information from existing projects that have gone on elsewhere. So to that point that was just raised in the previous discussion. During December's meeting, you've heard a progress report from several of the consultant groups. And so today we just want to provide a brief overview of the ongoing technical work and follow that up with some questions about basically, is there any additional technical information that you feel you need as advisory committee members to provide input to the roadmap? So we're going to walk through these really quickly because we don't have a lot of time, but next slide, please. This is the overview of the work that the consultants DNV are doing for us on the offshore wind energy analyses. I'm actually not going to walk through this slide because Selena did a good job of describing this already. But I did want to highlight one thing, which is that the offshore wind transmission strategy, task number 5, that includes research into best practices, including those on cable installation and maintenance that have been used elsewhere for us to consider in our process. So we are trying to bring that information in from elsewhere, what's worked really well, so that we can consider it in light of the context of the Gulf of Maine. Next slide. This one's actually for Matt, if he's still on, or I can give it quickly. Okay, great.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, just a quick update on where we're at with the Department of Transportation. We've obviously, it's no surprise that we've been working with Moffitt and Nickel for quite some time now. So they were the author of the offshore wind port infrastructure feasibility study for Searsport that I know hopefully all of you have had a chance to sink your teeth into. And then obviously the next steps is they're working on a phase 2 study for us to analyze potential port infrastructure opportunities as it pertains to offshore wind throughout the Maine coast, with some economic analysis that's pertinent to the business case for offshore wind in the region and in the state. And also we are also in the process of contracting with them to start data collection on site in Searsport to provide site survey, geotechnical information, and bathymetric survey, so we can help provide some of that data in our extended stakeholder outreach efforts. So a lot of data, and we'll have more to share with the group in the coming month. And that's all I have, Stephanie.
Super. Thanks, Matt. The next technical study that we're working on is the Maine Offshore Wind Supply Chain Assessment. We've hired also through the competitive RFP process, the Consultants Exodus Group with their subcontractors, CARP Strategies and VHB on this particular task, which is the offshore wind supply chain work. This includes an analysis of other states' offshore wind supply chain assessments and activities, looking toward a playbook that could be adapted for Maine. it includes a review of Maine's existing supply chain elements that could be allocated to offshore wind, with an identification of strengths and particular focus on things like shipbuilding, vessels operation and maintenance, floating offshore wind, artificial intelligence, and data science. The end result of this work would be a prioritized action plan to improve, and it will include some specific opportunities for minority and women-owned small businesses. Next slide. The next piece that's also being done under the Exodus contract, this is through their subcontractor, BW Research Partnership. The work that's being done here includes developing a clean energy employment report for Maine as a baseline for potential offshore wind workforce. It also includes identifying different training and education capacities in Maine that can be allocated towards offshore wind. Identifying workforce gaps that we have in the state that may be most advantageous for us to fill. And then finally developing that action plan that's informed further by stakeholder engagement and some discussions that they've had with some specific groups in the last couple of weeks. We had some public meetings on one with organized labor, one with industry associations and employers, and then the third was with education and training providers. Next slide. This project is pending, but this is something you've heard about today from both the Environment and Wildlife Working Group and the Fisheries Working Group. Their interest in a mapping project to inform our offshore wind planning for the Gulf of Maine. So the purpose of this effort will be to help highlight potential exclusion areas in the Gulf of Maine, as well as areas of greatest concern for potential conflict with existing ocean users and important wildlife habitat. The work will also help us identify areas where we need to gather additional information to inform our planning and decision making to best protect existing ocean users, the wildlife, and the Gulf of Maine environment. And we envision this to be a phased approach of mapping and analysis, starting with the existing data, then identifying gaps, and finally trying to secure and incorporate additional priority data for our analyses. And the state's looking at possible options for doing this work with the intent to start it as soon as possible. I think that's it, Laura.
Thanks for that overview, Stephanie. So as Stephanie put at the beginning, are there other questions or other pieces of research or technical work that the advisory committee thinks are critical for us to have to do our work? Is there some big gap that's missing? Yes, Matt.
I have a quick question about the studies being done. I'll keep it brief. So for Stephanie, I'll just say both of them so it'll make it easier. But on the study about supply chain, is the consultant looking at mitigation strategies for sort of the price spikes we're seeing? I mean, last year I think it was 20% material price spikes overall. Will there be something in there to sort of consider how we might alleviate that as we start moving forward? And for Matt, on the port piece, as you do the study, is the end goal to have, design build proposals, get some flexibility, some innovation there for people who might bid that work, or is there a plan for that at all yet?
Several layered questions there.
Okay, so I'll take a stab at the first one. I don't think that's an explicit part of their work right now, but I think that is something that we can talk with them about. I did see that that has been an issue with some of the other projects, and part of the value of this assessment, I think, is for us to identify where we might be able to fill those bottlenecks in supply chain and augment the capacity that exists in the US for these Atlantic Coast projects. But that's certainly something I can take back to Exodus and talk to them more about.
Great. I think the second question was for Matt.
Yep. And so to answer your question, Matt, we're really just the purpose of the second study as it pertains to the ports is just to identify sites that meet criteria to fill certain roles. So It's really just kind of conceptualizing that and seeing what sites could possibly work. Not any sort of preliminary design or anything really advanced past the concept. So I think as we start to mature into the industry a bit, we'll at least have the sites identified and can start handpicking which ones could possibly be advanced to some sort of design build phase or something like that. But that's probably down the road quite a ways. So very early and just simply identifying sites.
Great. Steve.
Just a quick observation about the supply chain spikes. This is not the reason I raised my hand, is that timing is everything in life. So by the time some of what happens in Maine is happening, we'll be in another supply chain landscape. Conversely, I'm aware from other things I'm doing that there are real problems today. So I think it's worth asking Exodus to opine on it. But this is I want to make an observation about missing data. The interaction with the fisheries community and marine users is new in the United States, but it's not new elsewhere. And I think we should be learning from the things that have worked and also learning from the things that haven't worked for both fixed and floating. There's ample information available on what's happened in the UK with fixed and floating, certainly in other places in the world with floating, including Japan. And we're foolish if we think we know it all and don't go out and see what other people's experiences have been.
Yeah, good point. Stephanie, is that part of any of the studies that we have currently?
Sorry, I lost my mute button for a second. Yes, we are collecting that information now. And I think we just need to get that synthesized and out to the group so that we can best learn from that.
Great. Habib.
I just want to say that was an excellent summary today, and thank you all for all the work that's ongoing. One of the things that needs to happen sooner than later is decide what the goalpost is for us in the state of Maine. Without a goalpost, it's hard to plan what workforce we need in the state of Maine, what supply chains needed, and so on and so forth. So setting a goal for Maine for offshore wind will allow us to know whether we have enough people to do the work or not. We don't have a goal yet. How can we tell whether we have enough people or we don't? Okay. So setting a goal for offshore wind, and whatever that goal is, needs to kind of precede all the other reports, because if we have workforce development reports without a goal, how many people do we need? Do we need 10,000 people or do we need 2,000 people? Well, to do what? So I think setting a goal sooner than later is going to help provide a lot more information for all the reports, Stephanie, that you're organizing right now, the workforce and others. So I'd like us to kind of see if we can have some discussion around setting some goals sooner than later, and agree at least to some form of goals that we want to reach in the state of Maine. And so I've had a lot of the folks who are doing consulting for us come and ask me, do we have an adequate workforce in the state of Maine? I said, an adequate workforce for what? What's the goal? And we don't have one. So how do you answer the question whether you have an adequate workforce if you don't have a goal? So I think setting a goal for all of us is so important right now. And then we go back to the consultants and say, here's a goal. It's a gigawatt by 2030. Is it 3 gigawatts by 2050? What is that goal? Do we want to supply floating offshore wind to New York? Because as you know, they're going to be doing floating. And how much are we going to supply to them? And what size of a port do we need to do that? So setting goals right now is going to inform everything else that we do. So I'd like to appreciate everybody's work and see if we can find a time to set some goals.
Thank you, Habib. And do you think we have the right information? I know DNV's study has several scenarios they've planned out depending on what those goals are. And maybe that's the place in which we'll get the information to start having that conversation more fully.
Exactly, Laura. The goals are just not restricted to how much we're going to do in Maine, but how much of that floating offshore wind supply chain in the East Coast do we want to own in Maine. As you say, New York's going to go build a lot of it, a lot more than we'll build in Maine in floating. Massachusetts will too, because that's where they're heading beyond. So how much of that supply chain do we want to own through our Newport facilities, through our supply chain, through our workforce, and so on and so forth? They're all going to need one, and they don't have one in the floating space. They have one in the fixed space. They don't have one in the floating space. So.
Got it. And I saw another hand up, but it's gone down. Was that you, Steve?
That was me. I was going to ask Habib about not our goal is not Maine's goal. It's everyone's goal on the East Coast that we could potentially supply. And he already hit it. Thank you.
Great. All right. I know our time is clicking here quickly, and I think we need to move on. I think these are all great questions. If there are things that come up in terms of gaps, feel free to reach out to Stephanie. I know they want to make sure that the whole advisory committee and the working groups have what they need to help make these decisions or help establish these different goals. So the last piece of the agenda, and I'll just roll through this really quickly. We've had quite a rich conversation already today about stakeholder engagement, but where we are in our phase, just to remind everybody, is here we are now into ending phase 1 into the phase 2, where we are planning on packaging the recommendations, the initial ones we have so far, fully cognizant that the working groups have that. You saw a long list of other things that the working groups are going to continue to talk about. But we have the first set, and we want to have an opportunity to bring those out to some focused stakeholders and have some conversations. We'll be putting those on the web and have a way to interact there. Next slide, please. So it's a good time to engage. We have these initial draft ideas, and we're early enough in the process to have some opportunity for people to understand really what Maine is doing and why it is doing. And there are some voices that haven't been at the table, and it's important that we start involving them in the conversation and also learn from what the other working groups are doing. If people aren't coming to the advisory committee meetings, the other working group members don't have an appreciation for the other pieces that are all at play as we develop the roadmap. Next slide, please. So we are working with, thinking about a handful of focused engagement sessions, working with the working groups to identify really the priority voices that haven't had an opportunity to participate. Those are, and get in front of them with some of the materials that we have, and we'll create and really sort of gather some feedback, and again, have opportunity for feedback on the website as well for people to provide some initial thoughts on where things are going, and maybe recommendations to the working groups on where to dig deeper or where to reconsider a particular direction. Next slide. So some of the key stakeholders we've been thinking about are some of the low-income Mainers, our rural communities. We thank you, Isaac St. John, for being here and representing some of the tribal interests that we haven't been able to engage with yet. There are youth groups and other local officials that are important, and communities. We talked about the MMA and the work they're doing, and we're hoping, and actually have already started, to reach out to that group to see if we can have a forum for them to learn more about what the advisory committee and the working groups have been up to date. So we would really appreciate both the working groups and you all to help us if there are particular gaps that you think we need to make sure we're targeting at this stage, knowing that in June, when we have or July, when we have the full packet of all the recommendations that's coming in the draft roadmap, there'll be another opportunity for further and even more broad engagement. Next slide. So success would look like us trying to reach some key voices, synthesizing that feedback and figuring out ways that the working groups may incorporate that feedback, or explain if they're not going to be incorporating the feedback that we've heard, and understanding each other's works better. It's, as well as, ongoing, as we talked about, the beginning of outreach and communication is just to begin to help educate people and make sure there's a two-way street so people know where to go for more information and begin to understand what Maine is focusing on and why. Next slide. And I think David, at this point, I get to hand it back to you for next steps. I am going to put in the chat my name and email so that if you have thoughts on groups that we should be reaching out to, if you are willing as an advisory committee meeting to help work with us, we really are looking at piggybacking on efforts that are already happening, and also creating opportunities for particular targeted communities that we think are really important to be reaching out to at this phase. So there, I'll pause, David. I don't know if we have a time for anyone to ask any questions, but feel free to reach out to me if you want to talk further about the stakeholder engagement piece.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's just where we are in time right now. I think that's what we have. We actively want advisory committee members to help us build connections into some of these key groups, right? So we actively, like, I've had conversations with some of you about how we get in front of your constituencies. We want that kind of interaction. So let's be in touch in the coming days and weeks about what this might look like in March and April to get on your agendas of constituencies and others that you think are important for us to be in front of. Okay, so we're at the end of the road. We wanted to do one more question. And first, if I can ask, Samanish has a new Menti link here. And if you could just drop that in the chat. We're doing this for everyone. So this is like, this isn't just the advisory committee. It's, attendees, anybody who's with us today, everybody's in. And the final question is really about what we're thinking. Let's see, is this linking into the right question here? I wonder if you can advance the question once, Samanish, because when I click on it, it goes to the when we'll meet in person. And so I want to get us to the final question, and Samanish will get this to the right question in just a second. And it's really about how would you describe the initial recommendations that we've been talking about today coming out of the working groups. You'll get the link here now to go to slide. Click on that link to get to that final question. We welcome, like I say, members of the public, anybody who's with us today. Let's just see how we're doing here. How would you describe the initial recommendations by working groups? This says AC members only, but honestly, the link is in the chat for everybody. So it's everybody. Go ahead, everybody, and just answer this. Feel free. We've got, on point and excellent, good, okay, so, and the final one is like, And so let's just take a temperature check here of advisory committee members and everybody else, and see how it goes. And Samanish, when you start to get results, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, that would be fabulous. So we can see what's coming in. Oh, it's there. Okay. Okay, great. So this is everybody. It's you all as advisory committee members. It's folks who are watching our meeting today. Go ahead, a few more votes. If you're looking at what I'm looking at on the screen here, we should take some comfort, right? That the preponderance of folks are saying, good, we're going in the right space, right? And that's at an early stage like what we're in, that's wonderful, right? Because it's tricky to get these things going. So thank you everybody today for being with us. Let me do two quick next steps. One is advisory committee members, you got an invite to go to a briefing by BOEM about the BOEM process on February 7th at noon. That'll be noticed as well online. Public welcome to attend. That's a 1-hour briefing, I believe at noonish on February 7th, a Monday. The other is we will be meeting in March, on March 30th, maybe in person, maybe not, we want to meet in person. We'll try to figure that out. And as we've mentioned a couple of times, we do want to be, once the weather's a little bit warmer, down in Cundy's Harbor with Terry, and have a meeting that's really focused on thinking about the coast and the coastline and building on some of the presentation that Ben gave us today. Terry, I see your hands up.
Didn't mean to, sorry.
Okay. That's right.
But I do have the community hall here if you want to schedule a May meeting after. Yeah. We do have the community hall down here, so I'm sure I can get that.
That I think we will be working with you, Terry, exactly on that. And I saw that Isaac St. John, you had your hand up earlier, and it's down now. But if there's something you wanted to say, Isaac, please jump in if you'd like. now.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that while I'm here as a Wabanaki, I only represent the Maliseet intentions. So just to not confuse everyone, I'm not representing all of the Wabanaki nations.
Thanks, Isaac. And I think that's great to be clear with our words on that about representation. So I'm really glad you're A, with us, and B, clear about that. Okay, folks are going to need to jump off soon. Grog, Admiral Johnson and Dan, anything else before we finish up today? Final words?
Just thanks for everyone's engagement. Great session.
Excellent. Hang on one
Great
second.
session. Great session, and I appreciate the fulsome discussion by everybody, and we are richer because of it.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Look forward to being in touch. All the best.